Greetings, boils and ghouls and non-binary drools, and welcome to the final part of the 101 actual scariest movie moments. This is Genre Grinder. I'm Gabe Powers, and this is Patrick Ripoll.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. I really thought out this intro, and it sounds great.
I like that you've committed to doing a Crypt Keeper thing for 8 seconds, and then immediately forgot the name of your podcast.
Yep. It was called something, but yeah, that's why I'm a professional. That's why I make the big bucks.
That's right.
So we're not going to go through the whole list again right here. Again, please listen to parts 1, 2, and 3. But as we said before, they're nothing compared to this. This is real scary shit.
I saved all of my actual picks for the top 20, so you're in for a treat.
Yeah, I just sort of, I don't know, I looked at the Blu-ray shelf and went, I guess that's scary.
And then look back at it, it's like you could kind of tell, right? Like I'm not actually scared of Scream 2. That was me playing it up. But now that we're in the good stuff, throw all that other podcasting away. The top 20 scariest movie moments of all time.
In all seriousness, I do want to intro this final episode to remind everyone that this series does not include any of the movies already covered on the Bravo or Shudder lists. So these are Patrick and I's personal opinions, and in the spirit of the episode, we tried to pick unusual and underrated titles across the board in a spectrum of types and even genres. And I'm reminding people of this for 2 reasons. One, because I know a lot of people are going to listen to this list last without understanding our imposed limitations. And will be frustrated when we don't mention Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist and Halloween and all their favorite movies. And I know this because this would probably be what I would do if I wasn't familiar with this podcast and I saw this. I might listen to the last part first. And then 2, I want to remind people that now that we're done and you have our lists and Bravo's 3 lists and Shudder's list all in front of you, now you can let us know what we missed and how badly we fucked up and what we need to cover if we ever do this again.
With the caveat that you shouldn't say Halloween 3 just because you think it's a masterpiece or whatever. That's fine. I get it. It has a cult following. None of you fuckers think that movie is actually scary one bit. I've never met a human being who thought Halloween 3 was scary, even the ones who say it's the best of the whole series. So send the movies we missed, but don't send Halloween 3, because who are you kidding?
Maybe they were caught really off guard by the bugs and snakes, because that that wasn't spoiled for them
in the spirit of some of our picks and like talking about the context in which we saw them, if you were a little kid, saw another little kid's head deflate into a bunch of bugs and snakes, I retract my statement. That could be scary.
Yeah, the rest of it, not scary.
Right.
All right, whose turn does it start this time?
It is yours.
It is mine. And we were just talking about how everything's perfect, and we listed this perfect, and I, as soon as we got to this, I realized that I put this way too high. But number, what is this, 20?
That's right.
Shit. Number 20 is Daimajin from 1966. This is something that I covered a long time ago when Luana and I did a kaiju podcast and tried to pick some non-Godzilla universe kaiju movies. And I think that even though this isn't as scary as I've put it, it's not like my 10th and our 20th most scary movie moment. Next to the original Godzilla and Shin Godzilla, which we both already talked about, I think the climax of Daimajin is as scary as a kaiju movie can get. So it should have probably been ranked below those ones, but it's still like a top 3 for me. And the thing that makes Daimajin scary is that it has this sort of focused destruction. I should say not the movie, but the character of the Daimajin is this focused destruction. It's not an animal wreaking random havoc or 2 giant animals fighting and causing a lot of collateral damage. It's the spirit of vengeance for this village that functions sort of like a golem, but way bigger than a golem. And it's this big stone creature that magically comes to life, and it protects people, but it does it in a very violent way. And it's a cool movie because it's not only a kaiju period piece, but it's a pretty typical Chambara samurai type movie that just sort of is invaded by a kaiju movie at a certain point. And the scene I've picked is basically just the climax where the Daimajin comes to life and just starts fucking up all the bad guys. And it's really brutal for 1966, and you kind of feel sorry for the bad guys because they just have bows and arrows and swords, and they're just like, they have no chance. It's even sadder than the Japanese Imperial Army trying to shoot missiles and bullets. It's like, it's just pathetic. And there's even a moment of sort of personalized violence where the Daimajin picks up a guy and crucifies him. And, I don't have a lot else to say other than that it's just a really good movie. There are technically 3 of them, and the first sequel is okay, but it's basically the same movie over again. But if you do see this and like it, I definitely recommend the second sequel, Wrath of Daimajin, because it's almost as good as the original, and it has based around children, so it's this sort of dark child's fantasy.
Yeah, Daijin, my 2 notes are, one, like, the problem of the Godzilla problem of you're bored to tears every time the human beings are on screen. This movie solves that by just like, what if you watched a whole ass samurai movie that just happened to have a kaiju at the end?
Yeah.
That solves that problem. So it is actually interesting when there isn't a giant monster fucking things up. And the other thing is Daijin is like Godzilla in that original Godzilla movie. Daijin just looks so pissed. He looks so angry. He is not an uncaring god. He specifically wants to harm you, the human beings who fucked up his day.
Yeah.
And that adds a lot of menace to him.
Fucked up his day. I like that. Because, yeah, it's like he was sleeping. And now he's up and he has to do his job and he hates it.
So that brings me to number 19 is Outer Space from 1999, directed by, this is Austrian director who I'm probably going to mispronounce his last name, but Peter Churaski. It's an avant-garde film that is built around manipulating footage from the 1982 horror movie The Entity, which I actually have not seen The Entity, so I don't know if it would be more or less scary if I had seen it, but it's nonetheless one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. And I had mentioned this earlier when I talked about Landscape Suicide, but I watch avant-garde movies. That doesn't necessarily mean I understand avant-garde movies because I don't have the background and the vocabulary to really unpack most of what's happening. I just sort of know that a lot of them I like, and a lot of them I don't have any feelings about whatsoever. And this is one of the ones I really, really like. And it really scares me. And it's 10 minutes long, and it's experimental, so there's no narrative, there's no scenes. It's hard to find the specific moment that's like, this is the scariest moment. So I'm just going to describe what the movie is. It's clips from The Entity that have been reprinted in this very high contrast black and white. And the soundtrack is very tortured and roughed when you can hear the soundtrack at all. And very quickly, the sort of what we understand as the realm of reality, which is scenes from this movie about this woman being haunted by this ghost, totally break apart because the film itself is tortured, it's scratched, you see scenes that are looped, you see scenes that are mirrored, all of the footage is degraded, it starts fragmenting, we see images pulled to like the side of the frame and you actually see like the sprocket holes of the literal film itself. The soundtrack quickly goes away from sound from the movie The Entity and just sort of becomes this cacophony of like, it's the sound of when you like plug an amp in a guitar when it's too loud. It's just that really cracking cacophony of like speakers blowing out. It's like, it's very physical. It sounds like the soundtrack connected to the film print itself is like falling apart. And that's really, physical is like the key word to this movie. Is it really just has an unrelenting physical feeling that basically no other film does, because every other film sort of holds a sacrosanct that the actual material the film exists on is like presented in as pristine a condition as possible, whereas this, the actual fabric of reality is just being like torn apart. And there's a lot of different high-minded ideas that Peter Churaski could be going for. This is typically how he works, is through manipulating film footage. So you look at his overall career, it's not necessarily like he's just trying to make something that's fucking sweet and scary. Like he's working on other ideas. But for me, as someone who it comes to it more from the horror side, like it feels like reality itself is being pulled apart. It's called Outer Space, and it really does feel like this cosmic horror. Like the atmosphere of Earth is disintegrating and we're left with nothing but the void, which in this case, it's the void of the light of the projector shining through clear frames. And it's the entity, so it's about a woman being assaulted by this supernatural force, and then the celluloid that the film is on itself is being assaulted. The best way I can describe it is like we've all seen ghost stories. We've all seen like ghosts and hauntings in movies and stuff, and those are always about like something from another plane of reality is interceding into our plane, but we are on the side of like the couple who moves into the new house or whatever. Like that's how we perceive everything, because that's the plane of existence where the plot and the story and the characters are. But outer space is like, what if there was a haunting movie that took place entirely from that other realm that is so unknowable and strange and upsetting and anti-human that like you can't even wrap your mind around it. And so what it actually feels like, it feels like you as a viewer are a ghost like haunting this woman. And also, it is just like available on YouTube and probably a couple other places online, and it's only 10 minutes long. So, like, just check it out. It's fucking incredible.
A way to describe it to someone who's never seen it but watches popular movies is there's that one bit in Fight Club where Brad Pitt turns towards the audience and starts talking and telling them how they who they are and what they represent, and the frame starts to shake, and you can see the sprockets and stuff. It's like if you just took that like 3 seconds and made it 10 minutes and made it so much more extreme. That's kind of the idea. And there's so much going on that I can't really tell what scenes they are, but I don't think he even used any of this ghost assault scenes. I think
it doesn't appear to so.
I'm not a fan of the entity, and it's also funny because the entity is way too long, and this is like the spirit of the entity in 10 minutes. Number 18 is I think, first time I've cheated and included a movie that was on the Bravo list.
That's right.
But Patrick did this more times than me, so I'm allowed to do it.
I did it 3 times. You did it 2 times. So
yeah.
We for a little background, we did when talking out this series, we did say, well, let's give since the Shudder list is about half picks from the old list, let's give ourselves 4 picks each. And so I used 3 of my allotted 4, and Gabe used 2 of his.
Yeah, but the real fact here is that Patrick used more, and I'm a better boy than Patrick because I used fewer.
Don't make him take away my gold star, please.
Anyway. This is also I am not a good boy because this is also just my favorite movie. This is Dawn of the Dead from 1978 by George Romero, and I just thought that they picked the wrong moment. And it's the thing is I don't really think of Dawn of the Dead as a scary movie, but it has it has parts that really bother me. If you've never seen Dawn of the Dead and you're watching it for the first time in 2023 and you're like 18 to, I actually take that back. You're 13 to 25. It's impossible to overlook that its budget doesn't match its ambition and that Romero has a lack of experience with action and that it's all dated on a number of levels. But it's so well written and does such a good job with melodrama, shock horror, and comedy that I've never really cared about those limitations, even when I was a snot-nosed teenager and saw it for the first time. It's the ideas and the characters are good enough that I'm just not bothered by the other stuff. And the other problem is that we've had, 20 years have completely changed zombie fiction by making it so mainstream. And so Romero's ideas are so diluted these days that I can imagine them not meaning as much to modern audiences. I don't think Dawn of the Dead or any of Romero's zombie movies can have that same impact that they did even when I was younger in the 90s. And that's too bad. But this is all just a sort of preamble to say that I've picked a moment that we've seen variations on now for many years, but I still remember the first time I saw it, and I still think it's a pretty powerful moment in a really good movie. Earlier in this film, Roger, who's played by Scott Reiniger, has been bitten by the zombie. And the implication is that he, who is a tough guy SWAT officer, was already having a bit of a nervous breakdown that sort of caused him to act recklessly. And that led to him getting bit. and he is now slowly dying. And during lucid moments, which are becoming fewer and further between, he's feeling like a burden to the other three people in his little band that lives inside the mall. His newfound best friend Peter is played by Ken Foree, and he's a SWAT cop. He's from a different precinct, so they really just. But during the scene at the beginning of the film, they've just met. But over this months or however long it's been in the mall, they've become very close. And Peter is literally cradling him as he dies, and he's full of morphine. And he's looking up at Peter from his arms, and he's making Peter swear to put him down when he comes back from the dead. And then he pathetically announces that he's going to try not to come back. And I've always thought this a really moving sequence from two, at the time, unknown actors. Ken Foree's gone on to do other stuff, but Reiniger really, he's in Knight Riders, and he has a cameo in the Dawn of the Dead remake, but he really didn't have much of a movie career, but I think he's a very good actor. And so then he dies, and the scene, this is the highlight of the scene, is Peter is sort of sitting Shiva with his body, but and he's drinking and he's reflecting on their relationship, but he has a loaded gun in his hand because it's a zombie movie, and he's preparing for the inevitable resurrection, because no matter how hard Roger tries, he is going to come back. And in the other room, the other two members of the group, Stephen and Fran, played by David Emge and Galen Ross, are watching a television broadcast. We assume this is the only television broadcast there is, because it's the apocalypse. And it's featuring an eye patch scientist played by Richard France, who we've seen earlier in the movie, trying to discuss how to deal with the zombie situation. And he is beyond the pale done with this, and he's frustratingly trying to explain the direness of the world situation to people who are used to watching the news and being told by government officials ways that we're going to solve this problem and life will go back to normal. And so he's posing ideas like dropping nuclear bombs on major cities, and everybody's shocked by that. But he's trying to desperately explain that that's how dire the situation is, that we have to give up and just deal and try to save what we have left. And there's kind of a famous bit where he just starts shouting "dummies, dummies," which is a little bit of levity in the situation, but it's really intense. So there's this intense thing happening on the TV, and Stephen and Fran are watching that and getting really depressed. And then in the other room, there's a dead person and someone waiting for them to be resurrected. And I think this is really moving portrait of what a zombie holocaust would be like for just people, not like how the government would deal with it, and not how, survivalists on the outskirts would deal with it, but just regular people. They'd be hiding and they'd be hoping for the experts to fix the problem, only to find out they can't, and finding everybody around them slowly dying, knowing that we may be a danger to those around us if we do die, and still being forced to mourn and then re-kill our loved ones in practically the same moment. So just when everything's reaching its climax, Roger slowly starts to rise from the sheet, and Peter reluctantly raises the gun. And in the other room, the argument on the TV reaches its climax, and Fran says, "It's really all over, isn't it?" And then we hear a shot from off camera, and we see the reaction of Fran and Stephen, who realize that means that Roger's been killed. And I still think it's the most dreadful single scene in any zombie movie. And I think it still works. And I think that no matter how funny and lively and just creative Dawn of the Dead is, this one scene is sort of at its center, and at the center of the drama of what Romero's trying to do. Romero has his comedy, he has his satire, he has his political points, and this is like the center of the drama that he was able to do.
Yeah, I think when you look at regional, low budget, like genre filmmaking, like that's the sort of thing that people like us are really interested in, because it's where you catch all of these little movies that don't get their due and stuff like that. But like a thing that you almost always have to do is just sort of roll your eyes and go, yes, all the performances are bad, but. And the thing that made George Romero so successful for so long in that world is that he was a great director of actors, and he always got great performances out of amateurs, which is like an extraordinarily hard task that is not always appreciated. But like Dawn of the Dead is just everything about it that works is because those characters are so good. And I mean, yeah, Tom Savini did a great job as well, but like the reason that you stick around for the story is long, it's not a short movie, and the reason you're invested the whole time is because all those performances are so good.
I'm gonna try not to come back. I'm gonna try.
Number 17 is Premonitions Following an Evil Deed from 1995, which is directed by David Lynch. Now, this is one I'm going to talk about real quick because it's a minute long and it's on YouTube. So you don't have to hear it from me. You can watch it in less time than it'll take me to talk about it. But I do want to give a little bit of context before you rush off to YouTube and watch it. It was made as part of an anthology film called Lumiere and Company. It was this film that was designed to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of film as demarcated by the release of Arrival of a Train. And what they did is they got 39 international filmmakers to produce 55-second shorts using the original 100-year-old wooden hand-cranked Lumiere camera. And they were given certain rules to sort of like put the same restrictions on them that filmmakers in the 19th century had, which was they got 3 takes, they had to use natural light, and they weren't allowed to use sync sound. And once you started the camera, you couldn't stop it, which means editing is kind of off the table unless you're very clever. And it turns out David Lynch is very clever. Now, I talked a little bit about my feelings about David Lynch when I discussed Blue Velvet, and that I'm not a David Lynch guy, and that there are a few films like Blue Velvet and Eraserhead that I just adore from start to finish. But for the most part, I think he's an immensely talented artist, and that almost every one of his movies has some dumb bullshit in it that I hate. And the thing about this 55-second short is that there isn't room for any of like the bad comedy or other stuff that I just suffer through in his other work. It's kind of like this pure shot of nightmare espresso. It's absolutely terrifying. I've probably seen it 100 times. The story is very simple. Police find the dead body of a girl in a field, and then after a sudden shift to black that is surely someone covering up the lens while they shift the camera to its next shot, we see her mother looking concerned in her living room. We then see the girl's abduction, but this is where the film goes into more surrealist nightmare territory because the girl is in her bed, but her bedroom is in this forest of some sort. And she gets up out of bed and she looks up at the sky, and then the entire frame is bathed in pure white, and then that white dissolves into smoke, and we see these really horrible, misshapen, alien-headed monsters like walking around in a circle around this tube, shocking this tube with cattle prods as a nude woman is sort of helplessly submerged in water inside, presumably the girl who gets abducted. And it's on screen for like 5 seconds, and that's just enough time to be totally hideous and upsetting and shocking, and then also for you to not really understand what you're seeing before it moves away to the next shot. It's like, it's an unbelievable, shocking image reveal that you just, even after you've seen it several times, you can't quite piece together what it is you're looking at. And then the camera pans over to a piece of flash paper that goes up in flames to reveal the living room scene again, where the cops walk in, presumably to deliver the bad news to the mother who has already had the premonition and already knows what they're going to say. A very similar sequence to what happens in the pilot episode of Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And like Dr. X or Outer Space, which I've talked about on this show, the actual film itself is definitely part of the horror because it is made with this 100-year-old camera. It does have the look of the like super early antique film. The film itself is very weird and strange, and the images aren't captured with a lot of fidelity. So things feel less like a photographic record of things that happened in front of the camera, and it feels more like a psychic transmission or something. And again, it's on YouTube. Check it out for yourself. It's one of my all-time favorite David Lynch things, and I think it deserves way more credit than some of his other more beloved films, which all remain nameless just to prevent Gabe from getting hate mail in his email address.
I'll do a quick impression of me watching this. All right. Why did Patrick pick this? It's not. Holy shit! That's it.
Yeah. I didn't make it clear. That's the shocking moment. Is that 5-second shot of that fucking tube and those aliens.
Yeah. Pretty intense.
Yeah.
Number 16 is Inferno from 1980. One more Dario Argento for the road. This is the third Argento I think we picked. Is it third or is it second? It's only the second, isn't it? We only picked 2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we only did 2. Okay, so just anyway, one more Argento for the road. Inferno is not his best film, but it actually features what I'd say are his 2 scariest sequences and one of his best just shocks. I don't know if it's necessarily scary, but very shocking moment for good measure. This was his follow-up to Suspiria, which is a better movie, but they put it on all those other lists, so I can't pick it. It follows a series of not only that, but they put it on those lists and they picked multiple moments. Anyway, follows a series of people who find themselves wrapped up in the mystery of more ancient evil witches. And the plot is pretty fractured, as you might expect, but most of Argento's ideas this time around surround alchemy and architecture rather than school dance and witchcraft, traditional witchcraft. So for me, evil buildings is a sort of favorite subgenre for myself, so that's something I really like about this particular movie, is the idea that a building can be infused with some sort of magical evil, not just being haunted, but like evil. The main character is probably Mark, played by Lee McCloskey, but he isn't as interesting as basically anybody in the movie, and definitely not as interesting as Jessica Harper's character, Susie in Suspiria. I mean, honestly, to the point where he kind of drags the film down. I have to say he might be the biggest problem with the whole movie for me. But Argento pulls a shorter version of the psycho trick that we talked about earlier, I think in the last episode, where you introduce a different character who the audience thinks is the main character and then kills them off early on to shift the narrative and the function of the film itself and sort of shock the audience. This character is Mark's sister, Rose, played by Irene Miracle. Rose comes to believe that there is something fishy about her New York apartment after reading about the mythical three mothers, the three evil witch sisters, which are in all three of the movies, Suspiria, Inferno, and the third mother, which came out way later. She learns about this in a cryptic book written by an alchemist who claims to have made homes for all these sisters. In the scene I've chosen, she is trying to follow clues that she's read in the book to find proof of the alchemist's claims that this is one of his evil houses. And she ends up in the cellar of this old apartment building, where she finds a small water-filled hole that's just big enough to like squeeze into. And she drops her keys in the hole. Then, like an insane person in a horror movie, she decides to crawl into the hole. And instead of just going and talking to the landlord and getting new keys. And she emerges in this sunken suite. It's a very big... I used to think it was a ballroom, but I realized it's supposed to just be a large suite. And it's complete with furniture and artwork. It's just been buried underwater and covered under the rest of the building for God knows how many years. And it's a really cool, surreal image. Because, again, you think it's just going to be like a small area of water, but there's sort of like... It's a little bit of that Alice in Wonderland, like through the looking glass. She goes into another world, sort of. And then she drops the key further, and it sinks to the bottom. And as the audience, we know something's up and that she needs to leave, just because it's, a scary movie. But it's very quiet to the point. The only sound effect is this sort of bubbling sound, which is not traditionally what you'd hear in a movie to represent being underwater, but is sort of more what it sounds like to be underwater in reality. But we see that there is a door out of her line of sight that is lazily opening and closing with the current. And I don't know how there's a current here, but whatever. She finds the key at the bottom of this and sort of stuck in the carpet. And she starts back up just as a skinless corpse floats into frame. And there's a very loud analog, synthesizer sting. This soundtrack is Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He just hits one chord real loud. It's a very perfectly timed jump scare because we've been spending so much time waiting for something to fucking happen that we know is going to happen. So the scene gets scarier because she's trying to find the hole, and it's that whole trapped under ice thing where you can't just raise directly up because that might not be where your hole was. So she raises up and bonks her head on the ceiling trying to find the hole, and she's running out of air because she screamed and all her air came out of her lungs. And meanwhile, the corpse keeps bumping up against her feet because it's rising up with the current she's created. And eventually she does find the exit and get out. But the lamp she used to find the hole is broken, meaning someone else is in the cellar with her. And a black glove hand, that's probably Argento's hand because he liked to do that, picks up the lipstick she dropped and she escapes for now. I mean, she dies later in the movie, but that's the sequence I like.
It's such a good scare. It's like so just perfectly constructed, and it's one of those things where it's like the reveal of that, like, really, it's not a skeleton, it's like a pretty juicy corpse that she keeps bumping into. That's like a great shock moment. But like the thing that I think was like really impressive was the super long tracking shot on the ground where you see the water on the ground of this basement trickling into this hole, and it has like worn this like groove into the hole, so it's like this little mini stream that's coming down, and it's just sort of winding and curving, and the camera follows it for just, it feels like 30 seconds or something. It's like a really long tracking shot of this water, and it's this like hypnotic, dreamy moment where it's like the movie itself is hypnotizing you with this water, and it's more or less reality when she is outside and when she goes into the basement, and then like by the time you get to the end of that stream into the hole in water, then it's Alice in Wonderland time, and it's like we've gone through the other side. It's a great sequence. Number 15 is God Told Me To from 1976, directed by Larry Cohen. Now, of course, Larry Cohen is more associated with comedic horror films like Cue the Winged Serpent and The Stuff and all of the It's Alive sequels. But this movie manages to be quite disturbing and scary while still maintaining that classic Larry Cohen quirky energy. Not to mention it has the classic Larry Cohen gritty urban setting. The story starts off as religious horror, and then it sort of takes this weird, abrupt turn into science fiction. For example, this is a movie that features a hermaphrodite alien murder Jesus brainwashing Andy Kaufman to shoot up a St. Patrick's Day parade. So, like,
right, I mean,
still quite weird. Like, you're like, oh, it's not Cue the Winged Serpent. It's like, oh no, dude, don't worry, this movie's weird as fuck. But the scene I want to talk about is actually very straightforward. It's got nothing to do with insane plot twists or stop motion or the bizarre energy of Michael Moriarty, all the things that you normally associate with Larry Cohen. It's just supremely unnerving and straightforward. So the movie is about a crime wave sweeping New York City. People are committing random acts of murder, and when they're apprehended, they simply say, oh, God told me to do it. And the first of these is a mass shooter who's on top of a water tower. And the cops on the scene, they want to wait for the gunman in the helicopter to come and take care of it. But Detective Peter Nicholas, played by Tony LoBianco, tries to take it upon himself to talk the sniper down. And Detective Nicholas, he's a devout Catholic, so when this very friendly sniper tells him that God told him to, right before he casually leaps off the water tower to his death, it really messes him up. So it's this classic kind of like cop into deep story where the detective is being pushed to the brink because he's unable to get a handle on why the hell any of this is happening, and he's also unable to square what's happening with his own faith. But the scariest scene in the movie comes after several of these murders have already happened, and we don't see the person do the killing. We start with the police already at the scene of the crime afterwards. And the scene of the crime is that it's a father who has killed his wife and his 2 kids. And it's really the performance by this father that sells it. And I wish I knew the actor's name, but he's not named in the scene. And when I look on the cast list, it's just like a bunch of last names. And I'm like, all right, I don't know which of these is supposed to be this guy. So I wish I could call him out because he's fucking astonishing. But I just can't figure out what his name is. But he is so unnerving specifically because the performance, he doesn't seem like he's trying to be like creepy or a killer. He's not trying to play up how twisted everything is. He's just got this like casual smug smirk, like he's part of like this new age cult and he's about to tell you the secret of happiness. He's like, you know, I used to be like you. It's like there's a real vibe like he's about to pitch you on a slow food diet or something like that. And it's like, you know, it's like he's not merely bathing in God's light. It's that he also understands how lucky he is to be chosen by God. And he's about to tell you the secret to happiness. And it's this energy that he brings to talking about shooting his son. And he even makes sure he's like, oh yeah, no, I shot my son. He was 7. Which is like, that's the kind of detail, like if you're talking to someone, you're next to someone on an airplane and you're telling a funny story about your kids, you'd be like, oh yeah, you know, the boy, he's 7 and he said the other day this hilarious thing. But it's just like, oh no, he was 7 before I shot him. Now he's not anything. You know, and he goes, yeah, you know, my wife, she tried to stop me at first, but then she ran, so I shot her in the back. And this whole time, Detective Nicholas is fuming because he's sort of been pushed to the brink already. And this is the best opportunity he's gotten so far to interview someone who has done these murders. And instead of answering his questions, it's just raising more of them. And he continues to interrogate this guy, and he's getting more and more mad at just how fucking smug this guy is. And I think it's like the contrast between the two is what makes all of the information the father's giving so much more skin crawling. But the worst part, and this is like the really scariest movie moment that like really upset me the first time I saw this movie, is he talks about his daughter running into the bathroom and locking the door. And he goes, "It's the only door with the lock." And the way he says that, it's like he's telling this great story. Again, you're sitting next to him on an airplane, and he's telling you this great story, and he's got to the part where he's like, "My daughter, see, let me tell you how clever my daughter is. She knew to run to the only room with a lock. Isn't that clever of her? I'm so proud." And then he describes how he deceived her to get her to come out. And he goes, "Oh, it was just a game. I said that mommy and her brother were just pretending." And he goes, "If you come out, I'll show you the trick." And like, there's something about the specific wording of that, like that specific line of dialogue. "If you come out, I'll show you the trick," that like suddenly clicks everything to make it just feel totally real to me. It's just like, yes, if you were in the moment trying to come up with what to say to get a little girl to leave a locked room so you can shoot her to death, that is the wording that would come out. It's so unnerving. And it's like, you never see the victims' bodies. You don't see bloody aftermath. There's no chalk lines or blood splatter on the wall or anything. It is just the horrible senselessness of the whole thing that comes out of this man and his smug, satisfied smile. And it's just the way that senseless, hideous violence combines with his religious serenity. And it is like the thing that is creepy about the concept of God told me to is perfectly encapsulated in that one character, in that one performance. Just a really, really great scene.
A couple notes from me on this one. First one is that you keep talking about, like you said about being sold on a cult or a fad diet and being next to someone on a plane, and I suddenly flash back to the first time someone ever tried to sell me crypto and I was trapped next to them on an airplane.
Yeah, this guy has real crypto bro energy.
Real crypto bro energy. And then we discussed this between things that you had a lot of bad dad energy in your picks. Did you count this among the bad dad energy?
I forgot about this. I do have a lot of my picks involve bad dad energy, which is very funny.
And then just on the movie itself, this was one of the Coen movies that I knew was special, but it took me a while to really. I think I had to see it like a third time, and then it really clicked with me. Where I think it's now my favorite. I really like Q. But this is probably his masterpiece in a lot of ways.
I would agree with that. This is my favorite Larry Coen movie.
Did I say Larry Coen? Did I say Joel Coen or something?
No, you said Larry Coen. I'm
okay.
I'm just agreeing with you.
I thought you were correcting me.
No, sorry.
No, I'm just very sensitive. It's part of my bad dad energy.
I guess so. Jesus, and now I'm the bad dad.
I told her that Jerry and Mommy were all right. The gun was a toy. It was all in fun, and if she came out, I'd let her play with it. I'd show her how to do the trick.
So then, taking it back to Italy for number 14, this is Torso. It saturates the screen in terror. That was my impression of the. Have you ever seen the American trailer for this movie?
It's a pretty special trailer, yeah.
Torso. It saturates the screen in terror.
Well, and specifically, you're doing a voice, like, in my memory, the trailer for Torso, it sounds like Space Ghost doing it. It's like, Torso! It saturates the screen in terror.
One of these kids is a psychosexual killer. Anyway, this is another giallo, and this is directed by Sergio Martino. And in the first episode, I think it was, I complained that Patrick picked the best giallo movie because I thought he picked this one. No. And then I looked back at our list and I'm like, I shouldn't say the best giallo movie, but the best giallo movie scare. And I was like, oh shit, that's right. I got to that one first. So this is not as flashy and hallucinogenic as some of Martino's other really great giallo. It might be my favorite, but it's not his best, is the way I would put it.
Yeah.
It's a solid proto slasher. And you can see that he has figured out that he needs to just do a murder movie instead of
a movie about insanity. It has a really great tone to the first two acts, which are basically, I think I got this from Eli Roth's introduction to the DVD, but that after he said it, I couldn't not notice it, is that every man in this movie is a suspect or is at least a very suspiciously violent person. And it has this, I think it's a good representation about how Martino, who shoots a lot of stuff that involves women getting murdered in horrible ways, he's still genuinely sympathetic towards his female characters. So it's this sort of rampant misogyny that, you know, is just a thing in Italian thrillers and some horror movies. But Martino seems to appreciate the women more than the bad filmmakers, I guess I should say. The plot is sort of immaterial, especially when we're talking about the scene I'm going to talk about. But it follows a series of psychosexual murders. It takes place in a picturesque college town where the school itself has had to close down after one too many murders. And the main character, Jane, is played by the impeccable and somehow still underrated Susie Kendall. She and her friends decide to head out of town for a fun girls' vacay in a fancy villa. And the second act culminates with the killer slaughtering everyone but Jane off screen. And she survives because she's hurt her foot and took painkillers, and it made her sleep through the whole murder spree. And he wasn't aware that she was in the house. So she wakes up and stumbles across the killer, dismembering the bodies with a hacksaw, hence the title. Most of this is out of our line of sight. It's not a particularly gory movie. But then there's this whole cat and mouse game where she's trying to get the attention of the people outside without alerting the killer to her location. And he eventually locks her in a bedroom. And now that I'm saying that, I can't remember how he gets her in the bedroom in the first place, but that's not important. While he's continuing to dispose of the bodies, she realizes that the key is still in the door. And she hatches this plan where she's going to slide a newspaper into the door and shove the key through the hole at the other side, dropping it onto the paper, and then pulling it back under the door on the paper. And so she's doing this, and the suspense is just at an absolute fever pitch. And she's jiggling and pushing, and it's very exciting. And she executes everything just perfectly, and the key it wiggles out, and then it drops, and it bounces off the paper. And we're just, as the audience, you're crushed. She's failed. This was her one chance. But the camera doesn't cut away. And she starts to drag the paper back because she heard the clang, so she doesn't know it's not on there. And just before the paper disappears under the door, a black glove hand comes into frame, picks up the key, and puts it on the paper for her.
Yes!
And it's like, I've shown this, I basically have made friends watch this entire movie just for that shot, just to see how they'll react to it. And I've never seen it with a crowd, but I imagine it goes over super well.
So this is one of those movies this is one of those scares, I should say, that is just like so fucking phenomenally conceived and executed that when you see it in a crowd of like diehard, bloodthirsty, fucking craven creeps, the kind of people who do 24-hour horror movie marathons, it's still, you just feel the shudder through the whole fucking crowd, and everyone is gasping at the same, even if they've seen the movie before. It's just like, it's so perfectly achieved that it sends a shiver down your spine every single time. It's so good.
It's just the concept alone is so great. Just like it's so good that you feel like maybe the entire movie was built around this one shot that someone wrote down somewhere.
I will say, like, Torso's a movie that I've watched for, like, I'm watching it for an hour going like, God, this really isn't very, I don't know why this has such a great reputation. And that moment is a thing that always makes me go, you know, I should give this another shot. I bet I just wasn't vibing with it. It's clearly a masterpiece. Look at that fucking key shot. Yeah, fucking love Sergio Martino. I don't have ready access to a lot of the giallo of Sergio Martino that I love the most, so I wasn't able to really give him a good once-over to find moments, but, like, clearly of his whole filmography, this is just sort of the pinnacle of perfect suspenseful scares.
Torso. 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 It saturates the screen with terror. Torso.
Number 13 is Extro from 1982, directed by Harry Bromley Davenport, which sounds like a comedy Bang Bang British character, but is in fact just a dude. Um, just unbelievable name right there.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was shocked too, and the opening credits came up.
I've never heard someone say it aloud.
Yeah. It's not in casual conversation. We're not always, as horror fans, talking about the work of Harry Bromley Davenport, but perhaps we should. So I want to start off by saying that in his 1-star review of Extro, Roger Ebert called it a completely depressing, nihilistic film, an exercise in sadness. And I agree 100%, which is why this is a 5-star movie for me. It's nominally, like, on paper, Extro is an Alien ripoff. It's sort of in a weird in-between space where it's like, what if E.T. was Alien? The creature has a similar sort of violent sexual gestation process that the xenomorph did, though I will say the birth scene in Extro is way more fucked up than the chest burster in Alien. But it also is just like a real commitment to unhappiness and to like domestic squabbling and child trauma and hopelessness and nightmarish surrealism and just like the most nihilistic ending you can imagine.
And it's a little bit like Possession. I hadn't thought about that until recently, but it kind of, it's like the grindhouse version of E.T. and Alien and Possession.
Yeah,
kind of mixed together.
Little bit. You're not wrong. And I it's not an artistic movie the way a Possession is, but there is something hypnotic about the pace of it because cause and effect so often seem to have nothing to do with each other, and you can never quite get a handle on what is happening or why or like what does the alien creature want. It's just a series of horrors presented to you sequentially. It's just irrational, and even if it can't touch, when you use a word like irrational, it's like, oh, is it Lucille Fulci? It's like, no, it doesn't really have the filmmaking power behind it to like reach the heights of Lucio Fulci irrational cinema. There is something about the really weird relationship subplot that kind of makes the repulsive alien scenes like that much more horrible because it's not just happening in a vacuum, it's happening in a world where also normal life fucking sucks. I think the thing is there's this push-pull where it's like certain scenes play out and you're like, yes, this is a scene in a movie. I'm watching a movie. Obviously the people who made this movie will at some point square the details of the plot, and I will understand why the seemingly random things that are happening is happening, because it's not made by maniacs, it's made by just normal people who would do a like upset dinner table scene like this. But no, that's not true. It's made by maniacs, and you will never understand what is happening. So anyway, there's a couple scenes in this movie that I think could make the cut for the scariest moment. There's a really, really great jump scare where a couple drive by the alien creature in the dead of night, lighting it up with their headlights. I already mentioned that the birthing scene is way worse than the chestburster scene, where a woman tears in half, giving birth to a grown man who then gnaws his own umbilical cord off. But for me, these also are just like, yeah, it's an Alien ripoff. It's insane, but it's sort of like in a recognizable framework of what an Alien ripoff can be. So for me, it's really about the end of this film where things just go totally off the rails. It's about a father who's been abducted by aliens in front of his son, and then 3 years later he returns, but now he's an alien mutant creature in disguise as the father. And towards the end of the movie, the alien has already killed about 6 people, and he's turned one of the boy's circus toys into a real-life dwarf clown. And there's a babysitter who's watching this boy, and there's a brief chase where the boy runs away, and the babysitter has to go after him while they're playing hide-and-seek. But then she gets knocked out by the clown. And it cuts to this overhead shot where you see the clown dragging her unconscious body down the hallway, who's led by a boy who just randomly, cheerfully honks a bicycle horn. And they're carrying this like weird trail of balloons that have manifested, and you don't know why. And there's circus music playing. And then at that point, you're like, is this still an Alien ripoff? Like, what the fuck am I watching? And the clown gets this crazed look in his eye. I don't know the name of the actor, but the actor who plays the clown is absolutely phenomenal. And he pulls out this huge ball peen hammer, but it's a clown, so it's like all rubbery and wobbly, like it's it's like a gag you would see in the circus. But apparently it's still heavy enough to kill her because he just starts bashing her to death in the head with it. And being murdered by a clown with a rubber ball peen hammer, it's a pretty undignified way to die, but the horror is not over for her. There's still a whole mess of terrible things that are going to happen to her dead body. First of these, the boy starts to suck on her stomach, and these like really thick veins of some kind of alien seed start running through her. Part of the gestation process is that it's like through a kiss, the alien deposits its seed into you, and you see like the veins of coming from his mouth sort of raising above her skin in a really upsetting, unpleasant way. Like, even before you factor in that it's like clearly a 7-year-old boy who is sucking on the stomach of a 20-something-year-old woman. Like, it's just like, even behind the scenes, you're like, God, it's so queasy. And then the way the boy was turned into an alien was by his own father doing that to his neck. So there's just like all sorts of really unpleasant sexuality going on in this, involving children. Later, the boyfriend stumbles upon her body, and it is so fucking gross. It has been cocooned up in the shower, and it's all veiny, and it's pulsing, and there's like these really gross squelching sound effects. It's so much worse than the cocoons in Aliens, and it got there 4 years before Aliens came out. So like that already is just like, oh my God, like, hasn't this woman been through enough? This is the moment, though, that really fucks me up. It's later on. This is where I'm like, why did I watch this? This made me feel so gross. It's her body cocooned up on the wall, but now she has this like tubular orifice poking out of the bottom. The shape of it is kind of like a hamster water bottle, but it's clearly like this dick that is coming out the bottom of her cocooned body. And the clown is sitting cross-legged in the bathtub looking at her, and he has this wonderfully horrible, creepy, toothy grin, and the orifice starts to sort of undulate as it deposits these gross, translucent gray-blue eggs into his hand. And then he proudly presents these eggs over to an overturned refrigerator that he's filled with alien goop, and he places the eggs there, and it's like he's tucking them in nice, and it's just like so slow and so elaborate and so bizarre, and the indignity the woman faces after her death is so wildly beyond the pale. And it's like, what are those eggs for? Those eggs only exist so the very final moment of the movie can be the lead actress coming home and getting murdered, and then the words "the end" appear on screen. So it's like they don't really add anything to the plot. They're just like one more avenue to be like just pathetic and cruel. And it's just like the whole movie is pathetic and cruel because it's like it's all the synthesizers are really low fidelity and they kind of sound detuned, so it kind of sounds like the music of the movie is mocking everyone who is in it. And it's just horrible. Or, you know, perhaps to quote a Pulitzer Prize winner, it's a completely depressing nihilistic film and an exercise in sadness. It's fucking great. It's extra.
You know, you'd think that the eggs were set up for a sequel, but for however much I can recommend watching Extra, I can also not recommend watching the sequels, which have nothing to do with it, or their own alien ripoffs that are or aliens ripoffs that are not nearly as fun or interesting at all. So
yeah, I've never had any interest, so I haven't seen the sequels. But like, goddamn, even if they were a little bit like the original Extra,
yeah.
I don't know if the world needs more Extra. I think we have plenty of Extra.
It would be weird if someone did an actual like a legacy sequel to Extra and we found out what happened to those eggs.
or if it just like continues and is even worse and more nihilistic, because oh God, no thank you.
Well, speaking of nihilism.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Number 12 is Cannibal Holocaust.
Yay!
1980 by Ruggero Deodato. This is a movie that absolutely deserves its reputation. It's incredibly foul. It's racist. They kill a bunch of animals on screen. Apparently some of them were eaten by the crew, but definitely not all of them were eaten by the crew. Some were killed just to be killed on screen. It's also a horrible experience for the main actress, and there are multiple rape scenes, and it's hyper-violent, and it's just a huge bummer all around. So if that sounds like something you wouldn't be into, definitely don't watch it. But the idea is it's a misfit film crew has traveled into the uncharted areas of the Amazon to make a movie about uncontacted people there. They disappear, and a different group journeys in to rescue them. And after a bit of adventure, which is very typical of the Italian cannibal genre, the second group returns with all of their footage, having known that they died. And they're hoping they can find out what happened, and then also still maybe sell this documentary that they were making. It turns out that the director of the movie was an absolute sociopath who wasn't getting the drama he wanted out of the natives, and so in an effort to make them act more savage, he and the cameraman commit acts of terrible violence to get the reaction they want. And because of that, they were killed. The Italian cannibal movie was already a genre at the time, and Deodato had already made one of these movies. So Cannibal Holocaust is a exploitation movie, but Deodato also claims that the documentary crew idea came to him after seeing horrible violence on local news in front of his children. I think he was also poking fun at Mondo movies, especially since, as we discussed in the first episode of the series, some of those were accused of staging atrocities for the camera in the guise of making a documentary, but he's never said that was directly something he was referencing. So anyway, I've chosen the end of the movie where the shit hits the fan and the natives who have been pushed too far. And I should say that the men of the tribe were off doing stuff earlier in the movie. So the documentary crew were basically just torturing women, children, and the elderly people. The natives come back and they chase them into the jungle, and then they just absolutely obliterate them. They're raped, beaten, beheaded, disemboweled, cut into pieces. Just everything you can do to a person is done in these final couple minutes. But the thing about Italian cannibal movies is they tended to have pretty lackluster gore effects, and they tended to show too much, and they tended to show it for too long, which is actually one of the ways that in which they are watchable. I think that if the effects were any more convincing, the entire genre would be entirely unwatchable. I mean, if you care about animals, it's already borderline unwatchable. And I mean, that's why they had to put the animal slaughter in there, because I think they knew that their effects weren't particularly convincing. But Deodato uses this sort of cinema verite camera to sell not only the immediacy of the violence, but the realism of the gore, because you're only catching glimpses of it. It has more scariness to it than you would ever see in these movies otherwise. And I also have this dumb thing where any sort of indication of filmmaking pulls me out of found footage movies. It's my problem, not the filmmakers. But the more I start thinking about it, the more it stops working for me. So Cannibal Holocaust gets a pass by, one, being only half a found footage movie, which helps the fact that the first half is pretty unremarkable. And two, there being this in-fiction reason for stuff like editing, because we know that there's a guy who is actually looking through the footage and editing it for them and actually warning them that they're going to see some fucked up shit. And then the fact that no one will stop recording because they're crazy sociopaths who think that they're going to win awards for this documentary. And the part that's chilling to me isn't just the imagery of these people being slaughtered, but the fact that they won't stop filming it as it happens. And the idea of someone being so obsessed with their art that they're willing to film their own brutal murder is like a conceptual nightmare to me that gets to me on that level. So the movie sort of leaves you with not just this violent imagery, but this sort of violent psychopathy that gets to me on that level too.
I've only seen it the one time. Very effective, very good. I don't know if I'm gonna ever watch it again, but
I mean, it's really well done.
Yeah, very well done.
The found footage stuff is so well done. If you can get past all the problems, which are a lot, there's a lot of problems. But Deodato does such a good job, and the fact that it was one of the first of its kind really helps sell it too. There's just the idea that someone was doing this so early on and actually getting it right. It is kind of crazy looking back.
Yeah. Number 11 is The Leopard Man from 1943, directed by Jacques Tourneur and produced by Val Lewton. And like most all of the films that Val Lewton produced, he also wrote the final draft of the script uncredited. And it's like classic Jacques Tourneur RKO horror movie, which is to say it's a morose psychological drama about the suppressed desires of women, but it has a title like a cheap monster movie. So in this case, the leopard man is not a half man, half leopard, but instead it's an animal trainer who owns a leopard, or possibly it's referring to a serial killer who is making his murders look like a leopard did them, but he's not actually relevant to the scene I'm going to talk about. The story takes place in modern New Mexico, where an entertainer's act gets a new twist when her manager hires this trained leopard to be a part of it, which is a bad idea because the leopard immediately escapes and is now stalking around this town. And this is the setup when Teresa, who's played by Margaret Landry, is asked by her mother to go get a sack of cornmeal for dinner. But it's dark out, and Teresa complains that it's dangerous. There's a leopard out there. Her mother doesn't care, forces her out. She even locks the door so she can't come back in without the cornmeal. So Teresa has no choice but to head out into the night. And first she tries the local store just around the corner, but they're closed, and the woman who runs the shop refuses to reopen for her. So she has to take the journey all the way across town, which takes her to this clearing. And the way it's shot, it's like this fairy tale where she's leaving the village and she ends up in this wilderness. But instead of like a witch's cave, there is this train overpass. And it's really just simply the way Tunar shoots it. It's one of the scariest locations I've ever seen in a movie. All you can hear is the howl of wind, and the cavern under this train overpass is just pitch black. And just off to the side, you can see moonlight bouncing off some white rocks. And again, like the way he composes these shots, it's all about the contrast between the light and the dark that makes it feel so incredibly pitch black underneath that overpass. Everything feels really dreamy and fairy tale like when she approaches, and it cuts to this long shot where you see this like beautiful mountain range in the background and a cloudy sky at the top, and there's sands and rocks, and it's just absolutely beautifully composed. And there's a moment where she stands right at the entrance before going in, and when she goes in, we see her completely disappear from the frame. It is just pure blackness in there. We don't even see the shape of her. She comes out the other side. She's fine. So she goes to the store, she gets her cornmeal, and she notices these toy wind-up birds that are on display. And she talks about how much she loved them when she was a kid. And, like, she is a kid, you know? Like, you look at her and you go, maybe she's 12, maybe she's 14. But it's 1943, so there's really no such thing as a teenager yet. So she is just coded, she is a child. But Val Lewton understands she's a child who's on the cusp of adulthood. And there's this sense of wistfulness to her. And it's maybe like the first time this character has ever felt wistful in her life when she sees these wind-up birds and she realizes that she's not as young as she used to be. And the store owner tells her that he remembers that she used to be afraid of the dark, so he maybe shouldn't let her go back on her own. But she's now determined to grow out of these childish fears. So she insists, no. What's there to be afraid of in the dark? I'm going to go alone. However, when she gets back to the overpass, she's presented with a choice because there are two different tunnels under the overpass, and one of them is pitch black, and the other one has like a pool of water somewhere. So there's a little light reflecting off of that, and there's that like nice wavering reflection on the wall. And she walks right up to the edge of the pitch black tunnel, ready to face her fear. We see her head disappearing into it, and it's too much. So she goes to the other one. And as she goes inside, we see that shimmering light from the water reflected on her. It's a shot that is very reminiscent of the famous pool scene in Cat People. And at this point in the movie, it's dead quiet. There's no music. There's no nothing. And she thinks she sees two eyes glowing back at her in the dark, but when she looks again, they're gone. So she's like, I'm just psyching myself up. I just need to get past this overpass. And then we get this great jump scare as this train roars overhead, completely breaking the silence, and there's flashing lights on her, and she runs out, and then she discovers that there is, in fact, a leopard. It's on top of the overpass. It's waiting for her, and that passing train just made it really fucking mad. Its eyes are all fucked up when you get a close-up of it, and it roars at her, and she scrambles away as it gives chase. She ends up dropping her cornmeal, and she's running, and from here we cut back inside to her home, and we see her screaming on the other side of the door. She's screaming bloody murder, and it's Margaret Landry gives such a great performance. The way she screams, she says things like, "If you love me, let me in." You know, it's coming closer. I can see it. Like, it is so scary because, again, it's on the other side of the door. We have to imagine what is happening, but she sells that what is happening is the absolute worst thing any human being could be going through. And it's made even worse because her mom thinks she's overreacting, and it's totally unrushed. She thinks, oh, my daughter's just being a baby. I can't baby her. I gotta let her deal with her fears. And she's also just mad at her daughter for taking too long to get back with the cornmeal. And it isn't until she hears her daughter give a blood-curdling scream that she rushes to the door, realizing her daughter's in danger, but the lock is stuck. And it's too late anyway, because when she looks down, she sees a pool of blood trickle out under the door. And there's this one little detail that's absolutely perfect that makes it just the most horrifying thing, which is the blood pools under the door, and then when it gets to the crack of the floorboard, it starts to travel down it. And it's like it implies the motion of the blood just by how it fills up this crack in the floorboard. And the horrible, horrible image of a little girl being murdered by a leopard is just like that much more ferocious when you see all of this blood coming out. But in a way that it depicted in a way that is still like you can get away with it in the 40s. It's not like, how'd they let this get by? It's very tasteful. It's not a ton of blood, but the way it fills the floorboard implies an amount of blood on the other side that's really interesting. And again, her death screams are just so terrifying. And it's like, and then the emotional aspect of like her mom possibly could have saved her if she only believed her, but she was so stuck in her own petty grievances that she let her own child die. And it's classic horror, like the way it's shot and composed and edited. It's like biblical. It's so influential. Everyone has ripped off this movie and these shots. The way Turner shoots that tunnel, the way you see any scary movie you've ever seen where someone stands at the foot of a cave or like an open door in a really scary mansion or something, and you only see blackness on the other side, like all of that is the Leopard Man. But it's also richer than just like pure frightening images, because it's also like this really complicated emotional journey that you go on about this girl growing up, about her coming to the crossroads. And it does this really great provocative thing where it kind of asks you, who is to blame for Teresa's death? You know, is it the performer who let go of the leopard's leash in the first place? Is it her manager who hired the leopard? Is it the flamenco dancer who scared the leopard and made the leopard run? Is it the animal trainer who kept a leopard in the first place? Is it Teresa's mother who made her go out even though it was dangerous? Is it the store owner who refused to reopen the store for her? Is it the other store owner who didn't follow his instincts and let her go back alone? Or is it Teresa for insisting on going back alone and insisting on facing her fears and telling herself that an actual danger was not a danger because she wanted to be grown up? It's like everyone is a little bit to blame, and it's just this whole system of failures. And Jacques Tourneur is so overwhelmingly concerned with guilt and shame. And that is like really the thing that makes these movies stand out and make it so much more horrible and make you so invested and care about the characters. And when you're wallowing in these emotions, especially later on in the movie when the leopard is a non-factor and we're only dealing with the serial killer story, like the twisted psychology of everyone involved is like really always at the foreground, just by this sort of dreamy way that Jacques Tourneur shoots everything. It's absolutely a masterpiece. The Leopard Man, this was a movie that I thought had a really good scare in it, but was kind of boring the last time I watched it. And when I rewatched it for this, I was like, oh no, this movie is fucking perfect. I love The Leopard Man, but this scare in particular is just unbelievable.
Yeah, I think it might be my favorite, the Luton and Tourneur movies. It's sort of incredible how well this scene stands up. Like, I think out of context, you could show this to a modern audience, and a lot of them would still be fully into how scary it is.
Absolutely.
And then for those keeping track, this is the first bad mom pick from Patrick.
Let me in! Let me in! Let me in! If you love me, let me in!
Mamacita, let me in. Let me in now that I've spent half the night getting the cornmeal.
It's coming! It's coming closer! I can see it!
Top 10. You know what that means. It's just going to get scarier from here. So if you can't take it, this is the time to stop. But if you can, number 10 is The Day After, directed by Nicholas Meyer from 1983. Just after I said this is scary. This is actually not a great movie. The British-made Threads is the superior and far more traumatic Cold War nuclear scare film, but Shudder cleverly included it on their list, so I had to resort to the okay American-made TV movie The Day After. And Jim and I both covered this when we did the Nuclear Scare podcast, which I think is the first really good episode of Genre Grinder. I think that's when I finally got a hang of it. So there's a lot on it. But despite being the inferior overall and actually kind of bad movie, like the second half is sort of not great, The Day After has a really good lead up, where we see all the ways these escalating threats between the U.S. and Russia are affecting everyday citizens across several walks of life in Kansas City. Meyer is best known as the guy who either wrote, directed, or both wrote and directed the three best Star Trek movies, which are 2, 4, and 6 for the record. He and writer Ed Hume are smart to take on the ensemble approach to the main characters. It's a not as good as this sounds, but it's sort of an Altman-esque approach to a nuclear scare film. There are really good scenes of people watching the news and arguing and being in denial and freaking out, or maybe even just ignoring the situation altogether throughout the first, it was technically 2 episodes, I suppose. And there's this nice air of paranoia as people try to decide how they're going to deal with the situation. And as soon as the emergency broadcast system goes off, people start prepping. Sidebar, actually, I'm not sure if I've talked about this on the other podcast before, but I was visiting my mother in Hawaii in 2018 when some idiot accidentally set off a warning that North Korea had launched nukes at Hawaii. And it was supposed to be this test of the new emergency broadcast system they had set up, but they messed up and everyone's phone went off. And I kept a screen cap somewhere in case anybody needs proof. But we were at a yard sale that morning, and the locals at the yard sale would just not worry about it. Like they just wanted to go on. One person said, I can't have no time for this. I got to sell this stuff. And then like a little bit of time went by, and another one went, are we dead yet? I mean, what's going on? And I was the one person freaking out. Me as the non-native, I shouldn't even say, yeah, well, I mean, it was a native people, but like the person who doesn't live there. I only calmed down after my mom was like, it's nothing. It's just a test. And I'm like, Mom, it's not a test. It says we have to. And then I finally went to her car and I turned on the car radio and there was nothing about it on NPR. And I'm like, okay, I think if they launched nukes, NPR would have some news by now. And then, it took, almost half an hour for them to send another text saying, never mind, false alarm. So I experienced this weird thing where I was the only person scared. But apparently the rest of the city, especially in the touristy areas, was just, mayhem, where people were, trying to open sewer grates and stick their kids in them.
Jesus.
To, save them from the blast. I had no idea any of this was happening because I was up, my mom lives pretty high up the mountain in Kula, and I just didn't see any of this. But so that spirit is captured in this film where some people are just not having it and other people are really scared and other people are like, we can trust the government. They'll take care of it. It's fine. And the thing that we know as the audience is that Kansas City is a target because they have a bunch of missile silos, which is like a good piece of information because you usually, when you think about nuclear attacks, you assume that they would attack New York City and LA and that you're safe in the heartland, but that's really where all the missile silos are, and that's what they need to destroy. We start to see the silos opening up and shooting off. And there's this sort of lame use of stock footage that doesn't really work and kind of loses a little bit of power. But the wide shots of people just looking up and seeing the missiles in the background are really effective. And the thing that really gets me is when people start to realize that seeing the missiles means either the Soviets fired first and the U.S. is trying to counterfire, or the U.S. has fired first and the Soviets are going to counterfire. There's no way there's just one-sided attack because there's too much of a time gap to obliterate one side before the other can launch. And there's this college professor played by John Lithgow, and he and his students see this happening, and they remind us that there's basically a 30-minute clock. As soon as you see the missiles go off, that means that the Soviet missiles have gone off either now or have already gone off, and you have between 0 and 30 minutes to get to safety. So for me, the scarier things than the bombs actually landing and killing people and the knowledge that there's, that they're going to die slowly, that stuff really sucks. And that's what the second half of the movie is about, is the after effect. And that was the thing that the movie, the real purpose of the film was to try to scare people into understanding that it's not just the bombs that are the problem. It's that after the bombs drop, even more people die from radiation poisoning and stuff like that. Yeah, so for me, the scarier thing than the bombs landing is the knowledge that they're on their way and there's no time to do anything about it. What do you do with that time? Do you spend it with your loved ones? Do you try to find shelter? Do you kill yourself in order to avoid the other horrors that are surely to come? It is this certain kind of dread that I think I talked about already on this podcast that gets to me every time because it's actually the anticipatory anxiety is actually worse than the actual event to me.
I think something that's interesting about these kinds of movies is that you're about 9-10 years older than me.
Yeah.
And so I was born in 1987. By the time I had any awareness of the world around me, the Berlin Wall had fell. I did not know any kind of Cold War terror in its era. I did not ever consider the idea of atomic bomb or nuclear apocalypse as just like something to worry about. It was a funny gag in movies and stuff like that. It's ha ha, look, duck and cover. It's so funny these people were scared of that thing. I have no reason to ever be scared of that thing. And then I think in a slow rumble that got louder and louder as his term came to an end, I finally felt that fear when Trump was president, because I was just sort of like looking at everything being like, there's no way this fucker doesn't want to set off a nuke. Like I just like psychoanalyzed him using my fucking
No, remember when he wanted to shoot one at a hurricane?
I don't remember this.
Yeah, he thought that we could stop a hurricane by shooting nukes at it, and then they had to say no. Yeah, no, so that was a real thing that happened.
So like after he got voted out, it was that 2-month 3-month window or whatever. I was just like, all right, well, it's all going to end soon, because it was weird, because I had already dealt with the dread of COVID being like this could be the end of everything as far as I know.
Yeah.
And then once we began to reach the end of 2020, I was like, oh, and this guy's going to drop bombs, and it's finally going to happen. And that was the first time I could ever relate to, because it's the sort of thing where you talk to people who are Gen X, you will hear them talk about like, oh yeah, like if these movies that were on TV, Threads and Day After, they were absolutely horrifying and terrifying and traumatizing. And you look at it and you go, really? They look kind of corny and cheesy or whatever, because you just don't understand the reality in which they existed in. And then that was when I did.
Yeah, it's funny. Remember the I Love the 80s show?
Yeah.
Everybody. Yeah, they actually covered Threads and just clowned on it the whole time. And I can't disagree with them. Or not Threads, sorry. Woof. They covered The Day After and clowned on it the whole time. And I can't disagree with them. It's because it's a cheesy, dumb. It's young Steve Guttenberg being young Steve Guttenberg. But Nicholas Meyer is a good filmmaker. So with all the limitations before him, he is able to get at least one really big, intense dread.
Yeah.
Scene out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
They're on their way to Russia. They take about 30 minutes to reach their target. So do theirs, right?
Number 9 is Ghost Watch from 1992, directed by Leslie Manning. This is my second pick that's inspired by War of the Worlds, following Pontypool. It's the third found footage movie on the list after Cloverfield and Cannibal Holocaust, which is maybe an in-betweener there. And found footage is a subgenre that I desperately want to love, but I almost always end up hating. And that's because I really adore when there's a really well-observed, accurate, faithful simulation of documentary. And the thing about documentaries is they are works. They have directors and writers and editors. They don't exist as portholes into reality, but they are manufactured, sculpted, biased depictions of it. And so many found footage movies, even the ones that are beloved, they don't actually have the integrity to worry about the details of documentary filmmaking. It's usually just an excuse for a low budget, and they're more than happy to cheat all the time. You'll get camera angles that wouldn't exist. You'll get characters filming things they wouldn't film. You'll get things picked up on microphone that you'd never actually be able to hear. You'll get movies that use footage from like a million different cameras without thinking once about who the hell would have edited it together and how they would have had access to like that one shot that's at a random ATM security camera for one scene. There's all sorts of shit like that just drives me insane when I watch found footage movies. But when they work, I really, really respond to it. And I feel like they work when the point of the format are those details. And if you aren't letting your audience suspend their disbelief that what they're watching is an actual document, then what you have done is create a horror movie with shitty camera work. and
yeah.
So many found footage movies are in fact just horror movies with shitty camera work. Ghost Watch is so effective because it was created by people who work in television, and it is produced like a TV special, and it has the actual TV cameras and the actual sets and even the on-air personalities who are in front of the camera. Yeah. They were really part of these typical BBC One productions. Everything about Ghost Watch feels ordinary. The premise is that you're watching a live TV special where a BBC television crew are going to spend Halloween night in a haunted house, getting the story from the family who lives there, soliciting calls from viewers about the supernatural experiences that they've had. And it makes sense as something that would exist. You look at it and you go, I understand why a television producer would greenlight this as like a live Halloween special. The way it's structured, the way that you can tell that they don't actually think a ghost is going to show up, so they've actually set about a half a dozen different places that they can cut back and forth to. Like, you see the logic behind everything. You know, there's just like a whole bunch of different anchors that they cut between. One is inside the house, one is outside interviewing the crowd that's gathered to watch the filming. There's someone manning the phones. There's like a main host who's interviewing a ghost expert who has experience with this house, but he also interviews this like skeptic in New York. You just sort of understand, yes, this is a television production. It passes the bullshit test, and you are able to totally suspend your disbelief. If nothing happened that was supernatural, you still understand why someone would think this would be good television. Which brings me to the craziest part of this. When I say it's inspired by Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, I mean it's literally broadcast on the BBC as if it was live and actually happening. Which, as you might imagine, scared the shit out of a lot of people once it starts getting spooky and the ghosts actually do stir up. A lot of people got mad when this thing came out. Angry newspaper editorials had. It was like a whole thing. I don't think they ever aired it on television again, on British television. It has aired in America and a couple cable channels and stuff. But I will say that the way I first saw this was not on TV. It was theatrically. It was part of a horror movie marathon. So even divorced from the context of like I'm sitting in front of my TV watching a live TV broadcast, it was still a very terrifying movie. So when I talk about the scary moment in this film, it's less that there is like one brilliant gag or special effect or something, and it's more that the entire work is an act of brilliant filmmaking that totally allows me to suspend my disbelief. It just commits so hard to reality, and part of that is that it is such a slow burn for such a long time. It's not like, oh, it's a little spooky, and now it's a little more spooky, and now it really is just like kind of a dull ghost hunter show, and then the last 30 minutes, everything goes fucking apeshit. And when that happens, you are already just bought in. So the moment I'm going to be talking about is at the very end, where a presenter hears that one of the daughters has been is sort of trapped inside the crawl space under the stairs. And this crawl space has been presented as the sort of center of this evil. When we first arrive at the house, it's boarded up, and we've already heard the story about a man who locked himself in there with his 12 cats and hung himself, and then they ate his dead body while they were all trapped inside. So it's like the crawl space is sort of just a space in this tiny house that we have grown to fear. And we hear this girl trapped inside, and you know, it's at the end of the film. Everything's been going haywire for a while. This presenter decides that she's going to go in, she's going to save the little girl, but the door slams shut behind her, and we get a brief glimpse of a face flashing on screen, because part of everything going apeshit in the last 30 minutes is that the ghost has jumped from the house into the broadcast itself, which means that it's not only like in the airwaves, like viewers are calling in and going like, the ghost is haunting us now because we're watching the special. Part of the reason I love this movie is there's this really fascinating theme of technology and the phoniness of television production. And it's just like everything feels so synthetic because there's just so many gadgets and cameras and doodads everywhere. And it's this like, they believe they are safe because they have all this equipment. And the ghost is like, no, you don't understand. You are opening doorways for me. I am manipulating you through your equipment. And it's just, yeah, like all the best found footage movie is really interested in that mundanity. Like, I think Lake Mungo is now a beloved mockumentary for that very reason, where it's like you feel the director shaping a documentary of this real story that happened. Or like the Blair Witch Project, a lot of that movie is just like, yes, I would definitely believe this is a student film project. The moments in Blair Witch where Heather is like giving her little speech to the camera and she's trying to sound authoritative, but she's just like some idiot in her early 20s. You're like, yeah, no, I know exactly what this vibe is. And because it's the BBC and because it's sort of aping the War of the Worlds broadcast, you figure like, oh, of course, eventually there's going to be a happy ending. Eventually they're going to placate the spirits. They're going to apologize and put his soul to rest, and everything will be back and solved. But it does not end that way. Instead, it ends with this crawl space devouring this reporter, and the presenter gets possessed, and he starts chanting, and then the movie ends. And it's just like, oh, okay, Jesus. I guess nothing goes right. I love Ghost Watch. A scariest scene is like maybe a bit of a stretch, but like as far as the most scared I've ever been watching a movie, when I saw this in the theater, I was not prepared for how bleak it gets.
This is one of those things that everybody's told me to watch like forever, and I actually had a copy of it sitting around, so I finally watched it just for this. And the thing that struck me thinking about what you were talking about, and Lake Mungo was one that you already mentioned. I think The Bay is another good example where there is a reason for the artifice. It is someone making a documentary trying to figure out what happened. And it's what I talked about with Cannibal Holocaust, where I get pulled out so easily from found footage that even good ones, I just don't vibe with them. But when they are set up like this, like a real document of some kind, and there's a reason for everything, it does help. Something that came to me is that I don't think George Romero gets enough credit for Night of the Living Dead doing something like this.
Oh, sure.
Of course Orson Welles deserves all the credit in the world for War of the Worlds, but Night of the Living Dead had real newscasters, local newscasters, just reading off the news, and it was like a way of, that was the way people experienced the world in 1968, especially, and that's like a big attachment to the Vietnam War. Is there's no mention of the Vietnam War in that movie, but that would be the way the audience would be absorbing the information. And so Night of the Living Dead kept on popping in my mind the whole time I was watching it, which was not probably their intention, but it was a really interesting thing that just sort of happened to me with me.
Yeah.
People are leaving the studio now.
Number 8 is, rewatched it. I was thinking maybe I needed to make it number 1 because holy shit, I forgot. Number 8 is Seconds by John Frankenheimer from 1966. I think Frankenheimer, who is a highly celebrated filmmaker, is still underrated as far as his ability to just set a disorienting mood goes. We sort of talked about this in the previous episode when we brought up The Manchurian Candidate, which is not a scary movie, but those hypnotism sequences are very distressing, and they're so disorienting. And Seconds takes all of that to the nth degree.
Oh, yeah.
For basically its entire runtime.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a horror movie for its entire runtime. It's actually a very contemplative, like, who are we really? Kind of, this is sort of like a worst case scenario for someone who suffers from disassociation, because it's about someone who is literally not himself and how the concept of self is fluid. If I think on that too long, it's either the silliest thing I've ever thought about, or it's just this absolute nightmare situation where you don't know yourself. So the story is, which is based on a novel by David Ellie, follows a man who's suffering his existential midlife crisis. He's played by Rock Hudson, and Hudson's casting alone would have been a real big deal back in 1966, just based on who he was as a very popular performer and like a man's man and all that stuff. This is before he was outed and had his AIDS problems in the 80s and stuff, which recontextualized him again. This was sort of a different recontextualization of Rock Hudson. And he stumbles upon this mysterious company known only as The Company that promises to fake his death and give him a new life, including major plastic surgery to make him look like a different person. Unfortunately, he also grows disenfranchised with his new life, which is by design artificial, prompting the company to take action. And so the scene I picked is basically the climax of the film, and he has put in a request to be reborn a second time. He gets a visit from this sort of mysterious head of the company who wakes him up in the middle of the night to express disappointment, but he does it with this sort of smile and passive-aggressive bad dad energy. He's also expressing disappointment in the corporatization of his company, which is its own little horror movie that we don't really get into, but there is this sort of capitalist nightmare thing going on too. Hudson wants to talk about all his ideas for his new personality and who he wants to be and why he should get to choose this time instead of them choosing for him. But he's politely ignored, and he is strapped onto a gurney and wheeled down a hallway. And anyone who's ever had surgery can recognize this sort of disquiet that comes from being wheeled down a hospital hallway, and you're on your way to usually a really scary situation. Some surgeries are really minor, so you're not that freaked out. But I've had enough surgeries that are like, iffy. And so you're in a situation where you're like, maybe I'll fall asleep and that will be it. And there's this eerie way that all doctors and nurses and staff act like everything's cool when it's not cool. You will know why they do that. They don't want to scare you. But in the process of not scaring you and joking with you and sort of like, so tell me about yourself while they're wheeling you off, this is a person you just met. It's a really disquieting feeling. And so that's going on here. As an audience, we know that he's just not he's not connecting with the reality of his situation. He has not figured out
that he has crossed a line. And the audience has figured this out, the way everybody's dealing with him and the fact that they're strapping him down. They're telling him not to worry that they're strapping him down. But he starts to freak out a little bit. And then the totally different kind of nightmare situation happens where all the people act like he's being irrational and rude, which is like I have that dream all the time where something shitty is happening to me. And when I try to speak up about it, all the people around me are like, you're being a little mean, maybe take it down a notch, take a chill pill. And so like, no, this is really serious. And they gag him. And as he's thrashing about, a priest comes in and starts asking him, I'm sorry, that actually happens first. I should say, just before he starts thrashing about, a priest comes in and starts asking him, what is your religious affiliation? He says, because I'm ordained as a priest, rabbi, and minister, which is already weird. And he starts just talking to him about religion. And this is another thing I've experienced being in a hospital before, where they keep asking if you want to speak to a priest. I don't know if this is everyone's experience, but I was in the hospital for a month one time, and I would just keep getting asked if I wanted to talk to a priest. And as a completely non-religious person, I thought it was really weird. And it really bothered me that I'm like, am I dying? Why do you keep asking me if I want to speak to the priest? What's going on here? And he actually came one time without me even asking him to, and I finally just said, I'm Jewish, which is only culturally true. I don't actually consider myself religiously Jewish, but that was the only way to get rid of him. So that's another very personal thing. Then Rock Hudson realizes he's reading him his last rites. And then he starts to freak out. Then he gets gagged, and he's drugged, and he slides into the surgery room. And Frankenheimer uses the most horrible fisheye lenses he could possibly find, and everything looks awful and hallucinogenic. And the surgeons are nonchalantly describing the mode of his death, because he's going to be reused as one of the cadavers for another person that wants to fake their death and be reborn. That's how you get out of the reborn program, is they kill you and disfigure you and use you as a cadaver for an accident. And so they're describing the way, I think we're going to do a car accident and he's going to have an injury here. And Rock Hudson's still awake. He's drugged, so he's not really functioning anymore, but he's still awake. And as he's passing out, there's just like one more shitty thing. The surgeon moves in and has his bad dad moment where he disappointedly states, "You were my best work," referring to previous reconstructive surgery. So like, you failed me, son. And he picks up a cranial drill and he goes to work. And the final touch is that the drill sound effect gets distorted, implying that it has hit his brain and his inner ear is experiencing it differently than it was as it was puncturing his skull. And that's pretty much the end of the movie.
Horrifying.
Yeah.
So horrifying. This is a movie that really captures it's very much like the setup is very Twilight Zone, but like, to its credit, it captures the thing about the Twilight Zone that really works, which is that like mid-century existential crisis of like corporate doublespeak, and all of the way that everyone talks about how everything is happening, and like you're the crazy one for thinking it's strange, is just like so unnerving and horrifying. And it's a subtle movie. It's a movie. I was so shocked when it was over, because I'm like, gosh, I thought there'd be more story. I thought there'd be more plot. I thought more things would happen in this. But like after it ended and I thought more and more about it, this was the first time I had ever seen it prepping for this episode. I was like putting these like pieces together, and I realized that it actually implies so much more than it tells you. And just the way it does it, it's phenomenal. But like, it's so upsetting and unnerving and disquieting for so much of it. And then like all of the visceral ways it is horrifying at the very last scene is just like a perfect payoff to that.
Cranial drill.
Skinamarink is number 7 from 2023, directed by Kyle Edward Ball. It's at number 7 because I already think, oh, maybe it's only this high because of recency bias. It's a movie that came out this year. But I did want this to this list to accurately reflect the most scared I've ever felt watching movies. And I have never in my life been more scared in a movie theater than I was watching Skinamarink. In many ways, it was like this ideal viewing experience. I was in the third row. I was a little sleepy. It started at 9 p.m., and it was very easy for me to just sort of sink into my seat and become absorbed in Skinamarink's really specific rhythm. Now, I've included a number of films that I think exist in the avant-garde realm, and I think this has like one foot in that world. This is not Outer Space or Landscape Suicide, but this is a movie that sort of draws upon stuff like that for its scares. And like something like Outer Space, it's like the very fabric of the movie itself is part of an expressive layer of cosmic horror. It's a low-budget movie shot in the 2020s, so naturally it's a digital film, but there is a heavy false film grain texture that's placed on top of everything, but it's not really actually trying to simulate film. In fact, when you see it on the big screen, something that becomes abundantly clear is that the fake film grain texture is actually a pretty short loop that sometimes loops backwards and forwards. And so the seemingly random pattern of film grain as you're watching this movie, in fact, reveals itself to like have a pattern. And like that's just something that sort of creeps up on you when you watch it on the big screen. I watched it again in prepping for this on the TV, and I have a pretty small TV, so I couldn't notice it. But like that feeling of just like, oh, I'm questioning the fabric of what this movie is even presenting to me as reality. And like the colors are subdued and faded, but they're not really like a perfect representation of what a film print does after it's been, you know, aged to 20 to 30 years. It's more like something in between an old film print and the degradation you get from like an old VHS tape. And it's got like a little bit of that pink hue that you get from film prints from the 80s, but like the scratches and the burns and stuff, they don't quite look like that post-Grindhouse fake film look. The sound is very much like a fading videotape, not like a film track. So it's what it really is just this sort of stew of nostalgic textures and audio quality that feels like you're dreaming of an old movie. And all of the imagery is just like pure like little kid sleepover, because the whole movie is shot at low angles looking up. It's this like really unfamiliar house, and you got all those little plug-in lights that you saw all over the place in the 90s. I've never been in a house that has those plug-in lights in in the past 20 years, but in the 90s, every house I went to had those weird plug-in lights. Maybe just because I'm going to the house of other people with young children, you know. It's, you know, there's cartoons and there's cereal, and it's like the house feels like scary and unfamiliar, and there's like unfamiliar house noises, and there's Legos and old toys, and everyone who talks, they're all whispering because they don't want to wake the adults up because we're supposed to have gone to sleep at this point. Like all of these shots really hyper focus on mundane, weird corners of a room that instantly like put me back in the place of being a little kid in my bed and staring up at the popcorn ceiling of my room and seeing like faces or mountain ranges and stuff like that. So everything about it is this total overwhelming audio-visual experience that makes you a child. You are vulnerable watching it because your mind is like back to being 6 years old again, because you don't understand what's happening. You don't understand what the grown-ups are saying. You understand something is wrong, but you can't contextualize it. And you are totally at the mercy of everything that is bigger than you. And when I saw this movie, I was just like totally under the movie's spell. And I was absolutely terrified about when it was actually going to become a horror movie, because it's a very slow burn. And so like for the first 40 minutes of the movie, it's like a little unsettling, but nothing overtly horror happens. But I was just slumping down more and more in my seat, because I knew something was going to happen. The word that had come out from early screenings of this was like people were left the theater shaking. It was like so horrifying. So I knew it had something up its sleeve. And I was literally like about 35 minutes into this movie shaking in my seat with dread for what was going to come. I was terrified before anything particularly malevolent even happens. And it's not really until about 40 minutes in when it gets creepy, because that's when one of the children is beckoned by a whispering voice that says, "Come upstairs." And as a side note, the way the dialogue is subtitled and often totally inaudible is absolutely one of those things about this movie that freaks me out, because there's a disconnect between what your own senses are telling you and what the movie is telling you is happening. And so it's like you develop this distrustful relationship with the movie itself. So the moment I want to talk about, it comes around this point where we're dealing with a POV camera. It's a lot of the shots are evoking the point of view of a child, but they're static shots. They're not necessarily literally representing a character. But this shot is literally a POV shot tracking this child walking up the stairs and into the parents' bedroom. It's all excruciatingly slow. The door slowly opens. It's incredibly dark inside. It's all dark blue and shadows. You can barely make out the figure of the father in his pajamas, totally motionless, sitting on the bed, and he's turned away from the camera. And there's something wildly upsetting about this body language. It's like this posture of someone who just murdered someone and is sitting with it. There's something like totally defeated and horrible about just the body language of this figure. And the boy slowly comes over to his side of the bed, but the frame, he gets close enough that the frame actually cuts off the top part of the father's body. So you just see his legs, and you see this dark, inky void underneath the bed. We were talking about the dark, inky void of Jacques Tourneur. Here's another movie that owes credit to Jacques Tourneur, because that space under the bed is like the most fucking haunted space in a movie ever. And you hear that father command in the same whisper, "Look under the bed." And now remember, I'm already in my seat, twitching, squirming, whimpering, twisting away in my chair, have my hands ready to cover my eyes if I need to. And I'm going, please, 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 do not look under the fucking bed. And there's like a 10-second pause as the camera is totally motionless. Kyle Ball is milking the fucking hell out of this movie. And then it slowly tracks down past the box spring to reveal just total blackness. Nothing. It's a void. And I'm like, is something going to leap out at me? Is the camera going to get sucked in? I'm like, at this point, I do have my hands over my eyes and I'm like watching the movie through cracks. And then the film camera comes back up and it faces the father. And you hear the child say, "I can't see anything." And there's no reply. So the camera starts to push back down again. And I'm like, no, this time for sure, the demon's going to come. God damn it. No, there's nothing there. And the camera comes back up and it looks across the bed to see the mother facing away from the father, away from the camera, her head slumped down, totally motionless. Again, toxic, horrible, upsetting body language, just terrible image. There's like an implied domestic turmoil here. It is all bad vibes. It is like, is this the moment before they tell you they're getting a divorce or like worse? It is like you walk in on your parents screaming at each other and suddenly you're 6 and you don't feel safe. And that is the thing about this movie. It makes me feel unsafe as I'm watching it because I am that little kid again. It is so fucking upsetting. And then the camera pans back to where the dad was, but he's gone. And you hear the mother call to the child. You hear her say, "Kaylee," and the camera very, very slowly, everything so slowly, the suspense building up so incredibly, pans back to her. You can't even see her breathe. As far as I know, the way they did this movie, they could have used a still photo. She is so totally fucking motionless for so long. And she starts to talk. But the thing is, when she starts to talk here, it's not subtitled. So you're actually like really leaning into your TV or to the screen or whatever. And you're trying to figure out what the fuck she's saying. And she says something like, your father. And then there's the sound of books falling or some like kind of clattering noise. And you're like, no, keep going. What? What is happening? My father, what? And then the camera pans over to a closet door. Nothing. No sound. It's just a void. Pans back to the mother. And then after a long pause, she goes, "We love you and Kevin very much." Which is like very much something a parent says before they do something terrible. And then you hear Kaylee again. Another long pause. And then the subtitles are coming back when she's talking. But they're coming back in a slightly fucked up way. They don't appear on screen the way subtitles normally do. Because she says, "I need you to do something." And the "I need you to" part is centered to the left in a way that you're like, oh, the subtitles aren't done filling in. Which is not the way subtitles have ever worked in this movie. So again, it's just like the very fabric of the film, the language of cinema, of how we understand these things to express meaning. He's fucking with that, and it's very like cosmic horror. And then what she says next, it doesn't sound like "close your eyes," but the subtitles say "close your eyes." It sounds like she just says "cow, cow, cow, cow." Like, so we get this like brief moment where "close your eyes" kind of animates on screen in a way that you haven't seen any of the subtitles animate yet, and you know for a fact that that's not what she said, so something is lying to you. And I'm like, no, fucking Kaylee, please do not close your eyes. I was in physical discomfort. Like my calves were tensing up so much that I had a Charlie horse in the middle of the night after I got home from this movie. Like I was in physical pain after watching this movie. And then she says, please. So Kaylee does. And when she opens her eyes, her mother is gone. And the camera pans back over to the closet. And you hear the mother whisper, there's someone here. But that isn't subtitled. You know that you can hear her say there's someone here, but that part isn't subtitled. So now it's like you're working out this system where you're like, I think when the subtitles are on screen, that's a lie. And I think what I can actually hear is the truth. But like, what is lying to me? Who is lying to me? What force is at work here? And then you hear this loud crunch, and you hear breathing, moaning, and crunching. And suddenly there's just like this really abrupt, loud tone. Like it kind of sounds like an audio-visual tone, like a dead channel or something you would hear at the very end of a VHS tape. It doesn't sound like it's being generated by any physical object or anything. And then there's a jump scare where you hear a sharp, loud, abruptly cut off scream and something reaching out of the closet. And there's like a frame where it freezes and you can see like the end of some sort of appendage or something. And then it cuts to white, and then you're back downstairs again and there's cartoons playing. And it is the most scared I have ever been in a movie theater. Every single step of it is perfectly designed to disorient you and to upset you and to further provoke you, you little fucking toddler. You don't have any control. I'm the one in control here. And actually, like, I have to say, like, this isn't a movie I love. I think when it does come time to pay off all of the tension, I think it falters a little bit. And there's one jump scare in this movie that I'm not going to spoil it because it is a new movie. But there's one jump scare in this movie that made me so fucking mad because it's so lame and cheap and corny and embarrassing that like it ruins the entire last 20 minutes of the movie for me. I was sitting in the theater watching this going like, I think this might be one of the greatest horror films I've ever seen. And then this single jump scare happens and I go, actually, I think maybe this is kind of shitty. Like it was unbelievable. And like after rewatching this, I think it doesn't bother me as much, but I still think it's like a really crappy jump scare. And if you edited that 3 seconds out of the movie, this movie I would like it substantially more. So it's like, it's not a movie I want to say is like, you don't understand. It's a masterpiece. Like, I think it tries things that it doesn't succeed at. But for the most 45 minutes to an hour of this movie, it's like the most scared I've ever been in a movie theater. It's the most scared I've maybe ever been of any horror movie, except for one specific instance, which is when I was 10, for some reason my mom let me buy Halloween on VHS from Suncoast Video with a gift certificate. And she said, okay, but don't watch it during the weekday because you're going to have nightmares and you won't get a good night's sleep for school. Wait till the weekend to watch it. And I said, sure, Mom. And then what I did was I snuck down in the middle of the night. All of our bedrooms are upstairs. So I snuck downstairs and I got right in front of the TV and I turned the volume low and I basically hugged my TV watching Halloween. And the first moment where Michael Myers is watching the babysitters and he steps out from behind a tree and there's a stinger, I got so scared that I turned off the TV and I ran over to the couch and I put a blanket over my head and I stood there motionless for like 2 hours, knowing that if I got out from under the blanket, Michael Myers was going to get me, but knowing that if I made a sound, I would get in trouble for sneaking down in the middle of the night to watch this movie. So I was like totally trapped. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I was about to die or get in trouble. And then after about 2 hours, I ran upstairs to my bed and I got horrible sleep and I was totally wrecked for the rest of the school night. So like for the rest of the school week. So my mom was right. And it's like the fact that Skinamarink was able to make me a child again, literally, like unbelievable achievement. There are things I don't think the movie completely works, but like there are things this movie achieves that are absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I think it requires an emotional commitment that when I watched it, I didn't get
Absolutely. And I am someone who does watch a lot of slow cinema, so I have a wavelength that I can just like set my brain to that's like I am going to settle into this and I am going to observe how it affects me rather than wait for the next thing to happen because for all I know, it's a Simon Liang movie, maybe nothing will happen.
Yeah, it would definitely, be in the right mindset to see it and then it will be like it definitely was a movie I 100% respected what it was doing and I really appreciated, but it didn't get me. And yeah, I think it's just because I wasn't putting myself in the right mind space.
Yeah.
Kaylee. I need you to close your eyes.
Number 6 is Plague Dogs.
Speaking of being a child.
Yeah, so this is 1982. This is directed by Martin Rosen and the animation director on it was Tony Guy. This is an British animated film. It is basically the follow-up to Watership Down, which was also directed by Rosen and based on another novel by the Richard Adams. Both are adult animated films about talking animals who aren't otherwise anthropomorphized. The plot of this one follows two dogs, a terrier named Snitter, voiced by John Hurt, and a lab named Rolf, voiced by Christopher Benjamin. They escape an animal research facility and are basically learning to de-domesticate themselves and survive while wandering the English countryside, as the people who run the facility are trying to cover up their seemingly illegal experiments. And so Watership Down is dark, but Plague Dogs feels more like an effort to one-up the sort of trauma dump that is Watership Down. And it's constantly crossing the line of good taste and into cruelty and bad taste. And then it will justify the choice with these genuinely perceptive statements and emotions heavier than like fucking supermassive black hole. And my favorite line in the whole movie is Rolf, who's the more jaded of the dogs, whose majority of his life involves him literally being put in water and swimming until he's exhausted and drowns, being revived, and then doing that again the next day. Basically the worst life you can think of for a dog. And they come across these animal research atrocities, and he mutters to himself, there must be some reason for it. It must do some sort of good. And it's just like the line for this movie that, again, keeps overstepping into bad taste, but it has this genuine quality about it that makes it work. Like Watership Down, the filmmakers lacked the Disney budget, but they used that to their advantage by blending this sort of painterly reality of the backgrounds with really simple cell animation work that is designed to look like real dogs, not caricatures of dogs. It will be off-putting for some viewers, just the way it looks. I will say that. But anyway, there's this. This is not the scene. This is not the scariest scene. But to give you an idea of what this movie's like, there's a scene that was deemed too disturbing for the U.S. release, where a hunter tasked with killing the dogs falls off a cliff and then is later partially devoured by the dogs, who are starving to death. And you can only see this in the longer director's cut. But for me, the showstopper is an earlier scene where a different hunter, who is just out doing his thing, accidentally shoots himself in the face. And the violence is largely implied. There's a pretty bloody shot of a man holding his face as he collapses. So what makes this scene disturbing is this sort of mix of the shock of someone shooting themselves in the face. It's sort of a jump scare, but it's really the emotional gut punch, because the hunter is treating the dogs with kindness, and he dies in a freak accident while trying to pick up one or approach one of the dogs. And the event breaks Snitter, who up to that point, he's had some sort of surgery done to his brain. So he's sort of schizophrenic or something. And he is up to this point convinced that he will find a new master and live a happy life. And as the audience, we don't care about the man. We just met him. He literally has no face even before he has no face. We care about how his death will affect the dogs. And after this happens, Snitter starts to believe what he's being told about him being cursed and them being the quote, the like plague dogs. The title is really that the facility puts out the claim that the dogs are carrying the plague to prevent people from approaching them and figuring out what they've actually been doing. But anyway, there are a number of traumatic movies I've valued and opted never to revisit, but for some reason, Plague Dogs isn't one of them, and I keep rewatching it, despite it ruining my day every time I do. But it's so good and singular and overwhelming that I just sort of conveniently forget that it's a painful ordeal, and then I watch it again, and I don't know what's wrong with me, but there's just something about it.
There's an emotional commitment to Play Dogs that is very admirable in a way that other upsetting movies on our list have not been so human. Despite being about dogs, like, it's a very human movie and very empathetic. And I will say, like, even as someone, I grew up, my parents had allergies. I never had pets. I never had a pet. All my experience with dogs is like they tend to just bark at me and bite me. So I don't like dogs very much. And I've never empathized with an animal to the extent that like I really make an emotional connection. So it's often like a thing where people go, oh my God, It was fine when in the horror movie when the people were dying, but as soon as the dog got it, I turned it off. It was too much for me. It was too upsetting. And that always is like wild to me because I'm like, I don't give a fuck about they're dogs. Like they're not people, whatever. Plague Dogs was just like, well, guess what? Checkmate. You are going to be upset by this. Literally the opening sequence of this movie was so horrible. The first time I watched it was prepping for this, and I was genuinely impressed by how overwhelming the whole thing was.
Come on, boy. Come on. That's it, fella. Come on, up we go.
Number 5 is Angst from 1983, directed by Gerald Kargel, if that's how it's pronounced. Again, Austrian name, could be doing it wrong. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of true crime, and I'm honestly kind of uncomfortable with the rise in fandom of true crime that's happened in the past 5 to 10 years. But also, I know that a lot of people who are into true crime are women, and their relationship with stories of women being murdered and kidnapped and all that is a lot more complicated than my own. So it's one of those things where it's I have thoughts about true crime, but I don't actually consume the documentaries and podcasts and stuff. And also, I don't have the same context and position necessary to really go into them. It makes me uncomfortable, but I don't feel comfortable condemning it as a movement or anything like that. I will just say personally, on top of all that, I don't find serial killers interesting. In fact, I think there's something depressingly ordinary about the patterns they follow and the people they target. And I think a lot of serial killer movies, in their attempts to make their subjects mysterious and scary, they end up kind of glorifying them, making them more than they are, because they end up presenting them as these anti-establishment figures. They're on the edge of existence. They're cowboys operating on their own rules. When in reality, you look at most serial killers and it's oh, he's another mentally ill sadist misogynist. Okay, cool, great. What a cool guy, And the brilliant thing about Angst as a movie is that it places you inside the serial killer's head, but it doesn't really ask you to sympathize. In Angst, serial killing is not a Baroque vocation. It's not a mystical calling. It's just a pathetic addiction. Its depiction of real-life murderer Werner Kaisneck, again, probably mispronouncing that, and his real crimes, it makes him seem more like a junkie than a genius. His crimes are simultaneously extremely horrible and detailed and upsetting, but it never seems like he is achieving something or you're witnessing some kind of great event. And it doesn't do this by dehumanizing him. It doesn't say, oh, he's pure evil. He's an animal. We shouldn't even try to think of him as a human being. It does this by making him intensely human. He's constantly talking about his plans and how he has it all figured out. And the entire movie is about watching this guy who is convinced that he is going to finally show everyone what a genius fucking serial killer he is. It's just about him screwing up. The entire movie is about him making mistakes and needing to improvise his way out of them. And it's a movie I could talk forever about. I think it's really brilliant on a lot of different levels. And it's every bit as provocative as any Michael Haneke movie, but it also has the bravery to be full of weird energy and humor as well, instead of being sort of shut off and cold the way every Michael Haneke movie is. Well, I mean, I think Funny Games is a movie that is more on the level of Angst in that way, but most Michael Haneke movies. A side note, I watched a bunch of scenes from Michael Haneke movies to figure out if any of them belonged on this list, and they're just too cold and cut off to really upset me in the way that Angst does. And part of what makes this movie upsetting, it's not just that you're watching horrible events. It is, of course, the knowledge that they actually happened, because the directors use all of these really interesting formal choices to keep you at a remove. It makes it seem, the way it's directed makes it seem less real, but you have the rigorous knowledge established in the first 10 minutes of the movie that what you are watching is in fact extremely real. The camera is constantly floating 5 feet above everyone, so you get this point of view eye that is totally inhuman because it's much taller than any human is. Or the camera is attached to the lead actor via device, so it has this unearthly sense of movement to it that you don't associate with cinema as it matches his movements. And then there's just this ferocious pace and energy and all these weird camera choices. You get swept up in it. And there's just so much energy that you get caught in the mania of this character, but then you always get brought back down to earth by the bleakness of the material. So it's just you're constantly disoriented. You feel like you're yo-yoing between watching everything at a distance and thinking about the way the movie was made, and then also thinking about what it would be like to actually be in this situation and how horrible it is. And so like the stalking, the murder, the post-murder cleanup of this family in their home, it's like 45 straight minutes of this movie, which is a pretty short movie. It's the bulk of the movie. And it's just upsetting the whole time. It's really bleak. It's nonstop. It's not in real time, but it kind of feels like it's in real time because it is so obsessed with the minutia and detail and the logistics of how he pulls off this crime. So it's kind of hard for me to pick a single moment from it. But for the sake of the premise of this podcast, I will say that because it's based on a true story and because the film basically lays out what's going to happen to the audience before any of it starts, there is a horrible sense of fatalism to everything. Part of what's so terrible is that there's no traditional serial killer movie plot beats. The victims you basically never get to know. You just kind of accept that you are there to witness something unspeakably horrible. But there's one moment where Sylvia Ryder, playing the daughter, gets free, and she makes a run for it. And she's tied up and gagged, but she manages to stand up and make her way to the back door while the killer is upstairs. And when he hears her, she's trying to work the doorknob, and he starts running down after her, so she just decides to go through the glass door, and it begins a chase. And it's the only point in the movie where it feels like a horror film, because it's the part where we think about the cliches of the genre. This is the killer. This is the victim who's running from him. She's running for her life. We're empathizing with her running. It's man with a knife chasing a woman in the night. It's a fucking slasher movie. For 15 seconds, it is a slasher movie. And it's this like, it is the scene in Funny Games where the mom blows one of the kids away and he gets the remote and he takes that away from her, where it is this like moment where you get this relief from the unrelenting terror of everything because finally you recognize something as ordinary. Finally you recognize something as generic. And so little else in this film is. And then, of course, it's immediately taken away from you when she's tackled to the ground and stabbed again and again and again. He's stabbed like 15 times, and there's blood spraying everywhere, on the walls, on his face. And then he starts drinking her blood, and that's the final murder in the movie. And it's so terrible, and it's so horrible, and it's so graphic in a way that the other murders weren't. And it's much more terrible because it comes right after them taunting you. You know what this movie is when you sit down to watch it. You know that in agreeing to sit down and watch a movie like this, you were agreeing to watch these things happen, but there's part of you that's like, but what if she gets away? And it's like, no, that's not the movie you signed up to see. You're watching Angst. It's a fucking incredible movie.
Yeah, I mean, just visually so compelling and intense. And if there was an action movie shot the exact way Angst is.
Have you seen John Wick 4 yet?
No, I haven't seen John Wick 4
There are
yet.
scenes in John Wick. I didn't put this together, but there are scenes in John Wick 4 where the camera is specifically doing Angst shit, and those were actually the scenes in John Wick 4 that I was like so excited and like, this movie's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Number 4, and this is where I'm going to start to lose everyone because I've already said all my interesting picks, so now I'm just picking things that really scare me on a weird level. But this is Brazil from 1985, directed by Terry Gilliam. You know this movie, and you know that I couldn't pick Takashi Miike's Audition, because they already had that on both the Bravo and Shudder lists. So I had to think about things that freaked me out. So this is another case of me seeing a movie when I was too young to understand it, because if you're 8 or 9 years old and don't know it's supposed to be funny, the only thing you get out of Brazil is a bunch of nightmare imagery. Even when he's being whimsical and fantastical, Terry Gilliam, he can't help but doing this thing where everything just has this bleakness to it and this emptiness to it. And I was actually a very big fan of both Time Bandits and Adventures of Baron Munchausen when I was younger, which is probably why I was allowed to watch this movie in the first place. But they also frightened me. It was a kind of scariness I liked as a kid who didn't like scariness. But for some reason, this one just went too far. I guess it's an R-rated movie. It's not aimed at kids. But I already talked about Sam Peckinpah keying into this sort of feel of an anxiety attack with simple editing tricks in Straw Dogs. And I feel like Gilliam is the opposite of that in this movie, where he throws everything at the screen so that the whole movie feels like sort of a prolonged series of anxiety attacks. And that honestly makes it funnier as an adult. But when I saw it when I was younger, that didn't compute to me. And then I also have this thing. I think we already talked about the sort of Kafka-esque nature of the situation of this movie, and the idea that you're moving through life and nothing makes sense to you.
but it makes sense to everyone else in the world. So you just have to kind of go along with it and play the straight man to the entire universe.
There is a lot of seconds in Brazil.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously something that gets to me. I have again, literal nightmares about this. I never have nightmares where a werewolf is chasing me or being stabbed by a serial killer. I had nightmares. The world makes no sense, and I just have to power through. And I think Brazil is actually one of the best Kafka movies. I think Orson Welles' The Trial is a literal Kafka adaptation. That's the best one, but this is probably a close second. And I'm guessing most people have already seen it, so I didn't really need to describe it. You're probably assuming you probably assume that I'm going to be referring to the end of the film, or at least Gilliam's original cut, in which Sam is tortured into having a mental break, at which point he falls into a comatose fantasy world, which is a very scary way to end a movie. But as an adult, that's the scene I would have picked, because it's dreadful. But there was a different scene that chilled me to the bone as a little kid. In an earlier scene, our protagonist Sam, who's played by Jonathan Pryce, is visited by a renegade air conditioner repair guy named Tuttle, played by Robert De Niro. And the joke, which is a very good joke, is that society is so tied up in overbearing bureaucratic tape that it's impossible to get anything done, and the only chance you have to get your AC fixed is if a criminal breaks into your home and fixes your AC for you. And so then in this later scene, the scene I'm talking about, De Niro has returned after Sam's house has been repossessed. He switches the oxygen tubes in the hazmat suits of the guys going through his house with septic system, so it fills their suits and they explode into shit, which again really freaked me out as a kid, and as an adult that's like a really childish joke. But De Niro achieves this, helps him, and runs into the night to do more good. But as he walks away, pieces of littered paper keep slapping onto his body and building up and engulfing him, and he's like fighting paper. And no one but Sam notices this is happening. And before you know it, the paper has totally engulfed him, and then it blows away, and he's just literally gone. And it's silly, but it's so bleak to me that the only hero in the entire world dies in a way that doesn't make any sense. Just when Sam and the audience have gotten a handle on how this world works, and there's this like ray of light that says, you know, there's ways around these systems that are oppressing you, and instead this nonsensical thing happens where the one hero is taken away in this insane way, and no one else even notices it's happening. And so even though that scene doesn't scare me as much as it did as a kid, the concept behind it I think is actually very terrifying.
Yeah, I saw this in just like my senior year of high school, like 2005 or whatever, and I feel like maybe in the past 20 years, this has fallen out of the art house canon. I feel like I don't see people talk about this movie as much as they did when I was a teenager. But like this was a movie that was like, had a very well-respected Criterion release. It was like one of their really nice packages at that time, where they had all the versions of it, the theatrical, even the fake cut that never got released, but like what Hollywood wanted to do with it. And like, so when I saw this, I was very much prepared for like, yes, this is going to be a great film, but this is also when I was like taking film class in high school. And so like my first thought when I saw this movie was, oh, that's what mise-en-scène is. Because this movie is so overwhelmingly anxious every frame, and it's purely through mise-en-scène. It's purely because every single frame is just fucking littered with so much detail and overwhelming like little bits of action and things going on that you can't focus on anything. Like you can't settle down because it's just way too claustrophobic and frightening. And so like this is a movie I think is quite frightening, even if it's not traditionally thought of as like one of the scariest movies. Number 3 is The Innocents from 1961, directed by Jack Clayton. It's a ghost story. It's a retelling of Henry James's Turn of the Screw. Its source material has been adapted countless times, including twice in 2020 in both the film The Turning and the Mike Flanagan Netflix show The Haunting of Bly Manor. But it's hard for me to imagine any of them topping this film, which is just one of the most extraordinarily beautiful gothic horror films ever made. The cinematography is by Freddie Francis, who's probably better known for directing a lot of seminal British horror movies in the 60s and 70s, but he also also was an incredible cinematographer, and he does his career best work here. It's really impossible for me to oversell how incredible this film looks. It's just full of really gorgeous, deep focus, black and white, these really long shots, and it works to build dread and paranoia because there is this feeling of being watched. There is this claustrophobia, like I talked about with Brazil. Like, there is this claustrophobia to this deep focus cinematography where you can see all the way down the hallway, and you see this like ornately ordained mansion with all of these, the woodwork and everything is just so intricate. But there's also scenes that play in high contrast where you have these like really deep inky shadows and bright white lights on the end of candles. And all of this is only emphasized by the editing, which is extremely dreamy, because most of the scenes don't cut from one to the next. What you get is a lot of fade-ins and dissolves from scene to scene. Often there's double and triple exposures going on inside of those dissolves where something happens and then an important object from that previous scene is now floating inside of someone's head like it's an intrusive thought as the movie sort of dissolves to the next shot. Jim Clark was the editor, and his work in this movie is just as vital and groundbreaking as Freddie Francis's cinematography. So it's just like across the board on a technical level, extraordinary achievement. And often when a scene starts, it's unclear if you're looking at an object or you're looking at its reflection, and it's about this woman. She's probably losing her mind, and it's like the film itself is very disorienting, and it's very internal in that same way. The story of The Innocents is about a nervous young governess who is hired to watch over two young children in a country estate in Essex. And while there, she continually encounters the ghosts of the former groundskeeper and the previous governess, but no one else can see them, or no one else is acknowledging seeing them. And she begins to become paranoid that the other people are lying to her about this. And the script got a final pass from Truman Capote, and he's the one who added a lot of the implications of psychosexual dysfunction and mental instability, which is also true. That's also present in something like The Haunting, where it's like very hard to determine what in the film is subjective and what in the film is objective. And the way the film hints at a history of her child abuse, but never quite goes into it, it almost reflects the psychology of a character repressing the trauma. It's like the movie itself is repressing the explanation for what is happening. So it's this really rich and fascinating take on what is ultimately a very classic Gothic ghost story. And the performances are really great. Deborah Kerr as the governess and Martin Stevens as Miles, the little boy that she's watching, both so great. Martin Stevens is so great as Miles. He is this classic, creepy, little precocious kid. And it's that thing where there's something inappropriate about how direct he is with her and how familiar their relationship is. And sometimes it's like he's the adult and she's the child, which of course ties back into her fragile state. And Deborah Kerr is so good at that, at being like really vulnerable and delicate and being overpowered by him in scenes. And the scariest scene in the movie isn't actually a ghost scene at all. It's between these two. So one night after chasing the children around in the dark, Miss Giddens is walking Miles back to bed. But of course, the way it's staged, it's more like he is walking her back to bed. And we cut to her tucking him in. And he has this really creepy monologue about how he wanted to, be up in the middle of the night running around because he wanted to be bad for her, because it was more exciting for her to raise a child who's bad. And there's this like really it's the dynamic between the two. It's never made explicitly sexual, but the look on his face and the way he talks about it implies like, I want to be the bad boy. I want to sexually excite you with how willing I am to be bad. It's this really inappropriate relationship, but in ways that you can't quite put your finger on. So you, as an audience member, are kind of as off kilter as she is. And as she's tucking him in, she finds one of his pigeons dead under his pillow. And she accuses him of hiding it. And he goes, "Oh, I was merely keeping it warm." And it's really clear that someone broke this pigeon's neck. And it's very obvious that it had to be Miles who did it. And she can't bring herself to actually ask him, "Did you murder this pigeon?" Because she's too scared of him. And she fears him to be a sociopath. She also thinks maybe the ghost of the groundskeeper is possessing him. But it's like earlier we already saw him get expelled from school. So it's like you don't exactly know what happened there either. And it's like, is this kid a sociopath? Is he a psychopath? Is this a murderer? And there's this incredible close-up where she holds the pigeon's body and you see his finger reach out and stroke it. And it's like the body of the pigeon is not necessarily overtly phallic or vaginal, but there is something very sensual about the soft texture of its feathers and the sumptuous way that has been lit by Freddie Francis that it turns into this really perverted sexual moment, his finger stroking this dead bird. Really fucked up. That a bird he probably killed for no reason. And she's kind of stunned at the whole thing, and she doesn't know know how to proceed with the conversation. So he leaps up and he exclaims, "Kiss me goodnight." And we go to this extremely tight close-up as he kisses her. And it's this closed-mouth kiss, because it's 1960, but it goes really long. And you see her eyes in this shot, and her eyes are wide and panicked as he's kissing her. And it's nothing really, again, that crosses the line sexually. It's not like, oh, I can't believe the filmmakers went this far involving a kid in this scene. But it just feels so wrong and unnerving. And the way she's panicking, but she's also like, she's the adult, but she's not pulling away. It's like she doesn't feel about this. There's like the implication that like maybe she's getting aroused by this. Maybe she is sexually attracted to this child. Like maybe that's part of her, psychology, and part of how she was messed up as a child is that now she is sort of projecting these sexual desires as an adult onto this child. It's really upsetting, like 5 seconds as they kiss. And as he parts and pulls away, we stay on a close-up of her mouth, and she's kind of panting and breathing heavily. It's a very post-coital kind of moment. And we cut back to him lying on the pillow, and he has the most lascivious look on his face. It's this, like, satisfaction. It's also a very post-coital look, but it's a little less like he's really horny for her, and it's more like the satisfaction that he has total control over her, and he just has confidence in his ability, and that in their dynamic, he's the one with the power. And we just hold on him, making that face motionless for a long time, really skin-crawling, and then we get another triple exposure of a candle flame, a dead dove, and the next scene it dissolves too. So it's like this red hot passion mixed with revulsion of the dead bird and no resolution whatsoever. We don't see what she says to him after that kiss, if she says anything. We are just sort of forced to linger in the awful, awful feelings of it. It's a really, really scary gothic ghost story, but like the scariest part of it is, of course, the inner psychology of the people involved in it. Amazing, amazing scene and a really incredible movie.
We joked about how we realized we had 2 Deborah Kerr movies on our list here between this and Black Narcissus, and I just realized they're both like really classy movies that disguise really fucked up sexual implications.
Yes, and also 2 of the most beautiful movies ever made.
Yeah, so Deborah Kerr is like a very special kind of screen queen, a singular screen queen, we'll say that.
For sure.
Yes, poor thing. I'll bury her tomorrow. Kiss me goodnight, Miss Giddens.
Number 2 is also mine, just so I did 51 of the choices. Gabe did 50, so Gabe is going to get the number 1 slot. But my number 2 is Targets from 1968, directed by Peter Bogdanovich. And it is my opinion that Targets is every bit the masterpiece and every bit as groundbreaking and confrontational and political and ferocious and singular a directorial debut as Night of the Living Dead, which came out the same year. And there is no argument that Night of the Living Dead was more influential. And I don't know a lot of people who would claim that Targets is as fun to watch as Night of the Living Dead. Mm-hmm. But every time I see Targets, I'm totally gobsmacked at what complete vision it has. It's totally uncompromising. It's totally unrelenting. It's ostensibly about 2 dual storylines happening at the same time. One features Boris Karloff playing a fictionalized version of himself. He's this aging horror actor who wants to retire because he feels that the gothic horror movies he's associated with are no longer relevant. The other follows Tim O'Kelly playing Bobby Thompson, who's this clean-cut suburban young man who lives with his family, he works as an insurance agent, and he has an uncontrollable urge to grab a bunch of guns and kill as many people as he can. Obviously, in 2023, we're very familiar with mass shootings and the kind of people who perpetrate them. But in 1968, the culture was very different, and Bogdanovich was not reacting to incel white supremacist radicalized by the internet. He was responding to Charles Whitman, the man who killed his mother and wife and then went on to kill 16 people and wound 30 others when he assumed a sniper position at the University of Texas in Austin. And I've seen it written that this film is also a reaction to the murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, but it was actually made before those murders. And it came out a mere 2 months after Robert F. Kennedy's murder. So it's really just like has its finger on the pulse of the culture more than is a direct response to those things.
And not even just that culture, but like the way culture went. It's kind of crazy.
Absolutely. But it's also like, it's not merely satisfied with being a realistic depiction of a horrible true crime like Charles Whitman's. It's also this really complicated treatise on the death of classic Hollywood and violence in American media and Vietnam. And it's really mournful of the death of classic Hollywood, and it's more mournful of the death of like a more naive time. But at the same time, it's like totally clear-eyed that time is gone forever. There's no way it's coming back. When you look at Boris Karloff saying his movies are no longer relevant, we as horror fans might go, oh, come on, Boris. Like, no, those are classics. We all would, 50 years later, we're still going to watch them. But like, as far as the actual prevalent culture is, he's absolutely right. That was dead. 1968, the Gothic horror was dead. And all the people who were making those movies had to scramble to figure out how to make them relevant again. You can make the argument that never happened. That Gothic horror after the 70s, like, never really went back to being as culturally relevant as it was before then. So as you watch Bobby Thompson in this movie, you know he's disturbed, you know he's going to snap, but there's really no telling when. Until one morning you get this really blood-curdling sequence where he shoots his wife, he shoots his mother, and there happens to be a young boy delivering groceries to the house, so he shoots him too. And it's like, it's very matter-of-fact the way it happens. It's very plain. It's very unemphatic. You're just following him through the San Fernando Valley house as he murders these people. And the sequence ends on a close-up of his note that says he's killed his mother and wife, and he's going to continue killing until he is caught or killed himself. Which is like, immediately, it's a horrible way to build tension and anxiety, because we just watch a really upsetting scene of murder, and when you end the movie with the camera on the close-up of this note, what the filmmaker is saying is, you haven't seen fucking anything yet. And it's true, because the next scene is the actual scariest movie moment I want to talk about. It's where he makes good on his promise by going to a chemical plant, and he climbs up to the top of a tank where he has a clear line of sight to the highway. And he's got these 2 big duffel bags with him, and you watch him set up all these guns. He's got like 5 pistols, he's got these rifles, he's got all this ammunition, and he also has a bottle of Coca-Cola and a sandwich. And it's like, instantly it's like he's a fucking child. Like, it recontextualizes these weapons as just like, these are his toys. Like, he brought his toys to school, that's his little sack lunch, and it's just, he's in his element. He is like the happiest he will ever be in his entire life, is on top of that chemical tower with his little sick fantasy right in front of him. Every passing car, it's like a buffet of people he can murder. And like, that realization that you are living in his fantasy, and it's not like a lot of movies about snipers or killers or whatever, it goes back and forth between like, there's the police detective who's trying to stop them, and this is the sequence where it would be like, oh, it's a race against the clock. Is Dirty Harry going to get to this guy before he does his, commits this horrible crime? And this isn't that movie. No one knows he's up there. He is totally in his element, and there are no obstacles in his way, and he has a freeway in front of him, and he has several high-powered rifles, and he's going to do whatever it is he wants to do. And the thing about mass shootings is you can't avoid them really 100% unless you just never leave your house. There's nothing any of the victims in that car did wrong. It's all pure wrong place, wrong time. There's no like, oh, if they were only more careful. It's like, no, they are just fucking driving to work or whatever, and then they no longer exist when he shoots them. At 1 second they're in the car, they're dead. It's so fucking frightening to think about. And it's like the idea of mass shootings is like, you are always in massive danger. You can never be comfortable. The other thing about this is it's a low budget movie. So when you see these streams of cars driving by, these are not stunt drivers. They just went to a highway and shot footage. So there's this documentary element that makes everything so much more horrible and real. There's no music. You just hear this dull roar of traffic. And when he eventually does start to take aim and fire, you see all these other cars passing by as the stunt drivers who are acting out the people being shot. They just sort of pull over to the side of the road. So this scene is playing out, but like, there's still enough long shots where you realize that there's just tons of bystanders who are going about their day. They didn't realize they were in a movie that day, the same way that those characters in the movie didn't realize that they just drove past a murder. And it's like the idea of everyone cloistered in their cars and everyone is in their own little hermetically sealed worlds. The American car culture is like a very selfish thing, and it's a very destructive thing, and environmentally it's a horrible thing. And like, they don't know what's happening to their neighbor. Like that to me is so much about like Vietnam and America at that time. And like the entire world is coming apart, but everyone is in these like cute suburban little houses, and they are all insulated from everything that's happening around them. It is the moment in Night of the Living Dead where it's like literally people are tearing their doors apart and they are sitting in front of the TV because the TV is real. What's happening at the door isn't.
Yeah.
Like that is there's another shootout later that happens at the drive-in, and that's a little even more pointed in this direction. But part of what makes this scene so incredible on a thematic level is that you have all of these real people really driving through, really living their whole lives, not noticing these people acting out, getting shot to death. And the camera, you become complicit because there's no one else to identify with. You never get a shot to inside the cars. You never get to identify with the fear of the victims. You are only identifying with him. And in fact, the camera assumes the role of the gun they paint a crosshair over the camera lens, or they don't paint it over the camera lens, but they paint it over the footage the camera shoots of the freeway. So it is like you are complicit in this horrible thing. It's the worst thing you can imagine. And you watch it nowadays, you pair it with the knowledge that this is actually not an aberration. This is a depressingly common occurrence in modern America. And he's fucking with your head because you kind of side with the sniper. There's moments where he like runs into obstacles and he reaches for a gun and the gun falls over the edge of a tank. And you're like, fuck, oh no, he's gonna... Wait, no, that's good. but it's that classic Psycho thing where it's like he doesn't give you anyone else to empathize for, so you feel bad for Norman Bates when the car stops sinking into the swamp. And by the time he shot like 5 people to death, there's a chemical plant employee who shows up. He kills him with a shotgun, but then he starts to hear sirens, so it's like, all right, time to go. And he runs off, and there's a brief chase or whatever. But like that moment on top of the tank where you realize that Peter Bogdanovich is going to make you watch whatever the fuck he wants you to, and that there is nothing in his way, it's like absolutely skin crawling. This whole movie is an absolute masterpiece.
I mean, I think my only complaint is that scene is so good and so intense that the later scenes don't match its intensity. They match they're better for the theme, but like it's like you spent the rest of the movie coming down from that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, there's literally thunder in the background as I disappoint everybody with the number 1 scariest movie moment. This is from 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1968, directed by Stanley Kubrick. So this is the hardest one for me to explain, and I almost just didn't do it. But Patrick assured me I should be honest, and I know that people will be upset. So on the most basic level, I find everything about 2001 frightening because it thrives on how inconsequential human beings are.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no real control over space. Alien beings are so far beyond us that we can't possibly understand them. And even the machines we make to help us understand them will eventually surpass us and see us as stupid children. There are other movies that do these things and do them with more focus and maybe do them better, arguably. But I don't think they do all three, and I don't think they do them in such a cold fashion. And for me, Kubrick's coldness is something that disturbs me throughout his movies. And I think it's more effective here because as a scare tactic in The Shining, yeah, it's scary. But in this case, it's not necessarily even made to be scary. There are very few points in this movie where I feel like Kubrick's trying to be frightening or even suspenseful. I feel like that's just something that comes along with the style of filmmaking he did. And for me, it's not Hal killing people, though that sucks, or people being stuck out in space, but it's the sort of climax of the movie, which is meant to inspire awe, and it definitely does, but I don't think of awe as necessarily a good feeling. Awe can be awful. Awe can be terrible. I mean, we're in awe of Godzilla when he's smashing buildings, and the imagery is so out of step with what we've been seeing up to that point that it leaves me feeling dreadful and disassociated. So the movie ends with, it's sort of hard to describe if you haven't seen it. I'm guessing people have seen it, where sole survivor Dave is going through the field. I can't remember what they call it. Shit.
Stargate can't be it, right?
Well, we'll call it a Stargate. How about that? He's traveling beyond. And so it starts out with just this sort of stuff happening, but like the way the music is intense and the way that Kubrick's cutting in still frames of his terrified face. And then we're sucked into this unfamiliar setting. It's like this really Baroque, or not Baroque, opposite of Baroque, this really starkly decorated house that's like a room that's like what an alien thinks a person might want to look at. And
it's suddenly he sees his older self and he becomes his older self, and he is losing a sense of space and time and losing a sense of self, and then he becomes a floating space baby. And it sounds silly to say out loud, but it's so fucked up and sad that it really gets to me every time. And there's also the space shit. And I talked about the last one, that Event Horizon scares me not because of the demons and the hell, but the space shit, because I'm never going to go to space. But it's really this just like refusal to acknowledge existence as we understand it. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm really sorry for the lack of climax here, guys. Just pretend I picked your favorite scary movie moment, even if it's already on the Bravo or Shudder list. But this is just something that every time I see this movie, it just absolutely just leaves me feeling empty and hollowed out inside.
This is a movie I don't talk about a lot because it's just sort of like it's a foregone conclusion. No one needs to, hear me talk about, 2001 Space Odyssey, a great movie. But like this is an extremely affecting personal movie for me for all the reasons you're talking about. And I find it so upsetting and affecting. But like, if you go back to the whole reason, and I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but for me, like, I think one of the reasons why at a young age you can become the kind of person who finds comfort in like dark films, dark books, things like that, material that acknowledges the more tragic side of life. The 6-year-old boy who wants to watch Beetlejuice more than he wants to watch, Air Bud or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I think a lot of that goes to this feeling deep down in the pit of your stomach that, you could call it depression or mental illness, sort of, but it's like this feeling that like everything is wrong and everyone is acting as if the life makes sense, but none of it makes any fucking sense. And 2001: A Space Odyssey is honestly like a movie that I find comforting in the way that some of these other horror movies I've talked about, like Carnival of Souls, I find comforting because it is a movie that accepts the world as I understand it, and it's like my terms. It operates on my terms in a way that so few Hollywood movies do, and like my understanding of like what it is to be a human and like what the limitations of meaning to being a human are and all of these things like are just like that is the. I mean, I don't want to say that is the thesis of 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a multi-villain film. There's a lot of things going on, but like I find it overwhelmingly scary and upsetting and sad, and I find that comforting because it is upsetting and overwhelming and sad in the way that existence is. So like I think this is a great choice. It's not necessarily like, oh man, you got to see this. You're going to jump so much when you see this baby. But like, this is a very overwhelming and frightening movie nonetheless.
Hey, thanks, Patrick, for explaining this one better than I did, by the way.
No, I agree with you. No.
Thanks for justifying my silly choice here. That really saved me.
I honestly I insisted that you go with this because I really do think like these are very subjective lists or whatever, and I think that if you just become the kind of person who second guesses your picks that are off the beaten path, then you're just making a list where you're like, yeah, The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and that's like against the spirit of the thing. So I think it's a good choice.
So that's the end. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
I had a lot of fun doing it. Thank you for having me, Gabe.
Yeah, and these all went on longer than we intended, but I think that in the spirit of it, people understood that. And I'll get back to normal length episodes shortly. And where can they find you, Patrick?
I'm the co-host of a podcast called 96 Greers, where we are tackling every feature film with Judy Greer in the cast. We just released an episode on David Gordon Green's Halloween, and coming up, we're going to have an episode on the new film that she is the lead of, Eric LaRue, which, if you can believe it, is a school shooting comedy, kind of.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. It's something else. So that was a fun discussion. I'm also have a podcast, Tracks of the Damned, where I did commentary tracks for horror films. Haven't done that in a while. So check that out as well. Gabe's on a bunch of good ones. We did Hostel Part 2 and Martin.
As usual, you can find me on the Genre Grinder Facebook, at Genre Grinder on Twitter. You can find me as Gabe Powers on Blue Sky now. We have Genre Grinder Gabe on Instagram.
You can go to the Genre Grinder website for more reviews, which I'm going to try to, now that we're done with watching all this stuff, I'm going to really hunker down and get some good reviews out. And we have a Genre Grinder Patreon now that's just under Genre Grinder. And thanks again to everyone who contributes, except for Patrick.
I'm the reason this went on so long, so I'm only contributing to your hosting fees.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Jesus. Anyway, so maybe we'll end up doing an addendum to this sometime, but probably not anytime soon.
Yeah.
So until next time, enjoy the rest of your spooky season, assuming I get this out finished before the 31st. If not, I hope you had a good spooky season. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I don't feel no pain no more. I don't feel no pain no more. I've left this cruel world behind. I found my peace of mind. I don't